Hello and welcome back to the reading room where we are doing proofread. And with me today is the amazing Dr. Dan Stern Cardinale, who is an evolutionary biologist, a science educator, a YouTube personality, and a pretty amazing guy in my opinion. But how are you, Dan? Welcome to the show.
I'm great. Thank you so much for inviting me on. Really happy to talk. I see you all over your channel, other people's channels, and always enjoy seeing you when you pop up places. So happy to chat.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot to me, and it's absolutely my pleasure. I really, for this segment, as I was mentioning before, I really try to get people that I find interesting, and it's sometimes hard to reach out. People don't have a lot of time, and you don't have a lot of time when I first reached out. So I'm glad that we could actually catch up and have a chat. But what really interests me, like the very first thing that really interests me. How did you come to this space? Like, why are you, without
Yeah,
trying to sound rude, why are you here? Like,
y-
yeah, don't you have real work to do?
right,
I don't. Yeah,
right. That is
yeah,
that is like the question that a lot of people wonder, because one thing that people who are familiar with like the evolution and creationism space, and like for people watching who don't know me, I'm an evolutionary biologist. My real job is teaching undergraduate students, like a lot of students. Like I have this semester that's going on right now, I have like 960 students, give or take. Like I have like that's what I do. I teach big bio classes at a big university. And most like biologists, and especially evolutionary biologists, don't think anything about creationism, interact with creationists, deal
right.
with it in any way. So like
Yes,
I'm weird. Let's just start there. Like that's a weird thing for me to do. How did that happen? It turns out that it's a really I think it's a funny story. So you have to go back to 2005, which for people who are way down the rabbit hole, you will know that the fall of 2005 was the Dover trial, Kitzmiller v. Dover,
oh,
the intelligent
yes,
design trial in Pennsylvania,
yes.
right? That was the fall of 2005. That was my first semester of college. And at the college where I
Wow.
went, every undergrad had to take every first year student had to take a seminar course called the freshman seminar program. You had to take a course outside of your major, and the idea was like the dorms for freshmen were arranged so you lived on the floor with the people in your seminar. So then you got
Mm,
exposed to like all these different kind of groups of people, and it wasn't just all the bio people and all the chemistry people and all the English people, right? It was you were exposed to all different people.
yeah, yeah.
So the seminar that I picked, it was a philosophy class, sounded really interesting. It was called "Do God and Science Contradict?" That was the seminar that I signed up for when I registered for my classes. And this class, it turned out, was taught by a physics professor who was an evangelical Christian and taught the course as an intelligent design propaganda course, basically.
Wow.
So while the Dover trial was going on, like day by day, we're getting the reports on, science blogs, right back in the science blog days and Panda's Thumb and like all those old school science blogs. We're
Hmm.
getting that stuff day by day. And then 2 days a week, me and a couple other students' class are basically fighting with this professor who's trying to convince us that intelligent design is real. And she's got us,
Yeah.
reading Hugh Ross and Michael Behe. Meanwhile, Michael Behe is testifying in the trial that's happening at the same time. And
Wait, what was the name of the philosophy? Like, what was the name of the
the
class?
course was called "Do God and Science Contradict?" was the name of the course, and it was in the it was
Right,
under the heading of philosophy, and it was a physics professor taught it straight
right,
up
right.
like
Yep.
as intelligent design, like was the course.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you'd expect it to be both sides, right? Like,
Yeah, no, that was
these are the
not.
things. Wow,
Yeah.
that's shocking.
What I was expecting was like history, like history of the
Yeah,
Enlightenment, bit of epistemology, like
yeah.
that's what I was expecting. And what I got was here's Michael Behe's book, he's right. Right. And
Whoa. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
so over the course of this semester, I learned largely self-taught a ton of evolutionary biology because I'm arguing with a creationist all
right.
semester long. And
Yeah.
that's what got me into evolutionary biology. So there was never like a time where I wasn't into evolutionary biology separate from creationism. From the
Gotcha.
get-go, those two things were always joined. So it's like
So, you
always been part of that interest.
so what did you go into university to actually study? Like, what was your intention at that
Yeah.
time?
So as an undergrad, I was a bio major. And then
Oh, just
and
normal
just
biology,
bio
right?
so the school that I
Yeah.
went to as an
Yeah.
undergraduate was small. My whole graduating class was only like 1,200 people. So small school, small public school.
Okay.
And I graduated in 2009, Great Recession,
Mhm.
no jobs. And I was like, well, I guess I'll get a master's degree, right? And I like genetics, so I'll get a master's degree in this genetics program at a different school. And like,
Mhm.
I get 2 years, I'll figure it out, right? Well, I ended up TAing to pay for the master's degree and really fell in love with teaching and realized if I want to teach, I have to get a PhD. So I ended up staying for 6 years instead of 2 years. Uh, and
Right.
the PhD was viral experimental evolution. And here,
Mhm. So was that your sort of dissertation or thesis for your doctorate was viral evolution?
yeah, yeah, it's all about my specific thing was looking at bacteriophages, treating them with
Mhm.
which are viruses that infect bacteria, and the ones that I
Yep.
played with infect E. coli. So I would grow up E. coli, in petri dishes, and I'd infect it with bacteriophages, and under all different conditions. The big thing that I did was treat them with mutagens, and then document their fitness as the mutations accumulated. So I would look at
Right.
things like how rapidly the thing you calculate is called doubling time. So how fast does that
Mhm.
population double in size? And by sampling over a period of time, you can calculate that curve. And so I look at
Mhm.
the non-mutagenized populations, look at the mutagenized populations, sequence all their genomes, look at the accumulation of mutations, how that correlated with the fitness, and kind of dig into it. That's what I did as a
Mhm.
graduate student. That was a lot of my thing. Which turned
That's
out
cool.
to be like super relevant because what I was doing was basically like research into what creationists call genetic entropy, right? Like
Yes.
that's what my research was on, basically.
And that was definitely one of my topics to bring up. I know very little about bacteriophages. All I know is that they've been suggested that they might take over for sort of antibacterial treatments when
Yeah.
they become less and less, the bacteria become more resistant. So we're kind of in a race war with bacteria kind of thing, a fitness war with
Like
bacteria,
an
I
like an
guess you
arms
could say.
race, right? Like we have to
Yeah,
develop the
yeah.
treatments before the existing treatments
Yep.
stop working. Yeah.
Right, which
Yeah.
is just fascinating, and it sort of leads me into, like, a lot of creationists that I meet sort of say, "Well, what does evolution do for us? Why do we need it?" kind of thing. And I guess relevant to that is, what would we lose if evolution was removed from schools? Like, we all know that Kent Hovind for instance, wants to remove evolution
Right.
from schools. And I really wanted to ask, what do you envisage as the knock-on effect of that? What would we lose, if anything, I guess?
Yeah.
I would imagine we would lose something.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, there's kind of a small scale thing, and then there's like the larger scale problem with that, right? And the small scale
Right.
thing is that, and I say small scale, maybe proximate's a better word, but like
Mhm.
all of the field of biology is based on evolution. Even subfields you wouldn't think are built on evolution actually are. And so,
Yep.
like, for example, you'll hear creationists like Michael Behe say, like, he's a biochemist and he'll be like, I don't use evolution in my research. Really? So you don't study one thing to figure out how the same system works in another thing? Because the reason that's the case is because they share a common ancestor, right?
Right.
Like we can
Yep.
study how a certain process works in this organism, and that's informative about how it works over here because they share a common ancestor. And if you take that away, you're removing from biology one of the main ways we understand things. And there are features that we can look at E.
Right.
coli that work the same in humans. There are features in yeast that work the same in humans. There are features in
Mhm.
mice that work the same in humans,
Right.
right? And the reason that's the case is because we have among those organisms an increasing level of relatedness. So we share
Mhm.
more recently evolved traits, more recent derived traits. So studying one
Yep.
thing is informative about the other things. If you remove evolution from that equation, you pull the rug out from that whole endeavor, right? Now the only way to learn about how this organism works is to study that organism, because there's no reason it's necessarily going to be informative about something else.
So do you mean like if evolution is not true, then a clam is just as related to a human as a mouse is?
Which is to say, not at all. So
right, exactly,
so
yeah.
why would we think doing drug trials on mice is informative about how they're going to affect
Mhm.
humans? If the
We
biochemical
should do it on
pathways are
clams,
unrelated,
right?
why would we think they're the same? Why would we think it's relevant what happens there, right?
I think the argument for Steelman, well, I mean, Steelman's a very generous word, but they sort of say, well, God created them similar so we could experiment on them, which is such a weird thing to do.
And completely untestable, right? Not only God
Right.
created them separately, but then for this specific purpose, like that,
Mm.
so we could do the experiments, so we could learn from that
Yeah.
part of it is like so beyond the realm of being testable, because you could evaluate the created separately part, and there are papers and experiments that do that, right? That we can evaluate. The for this specific purpose requires being in God's head. We
Right.
can't evaluate that, right? That's
No,
we're
absolutely
done.
not.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a lack of sort of evaluation in general. Well, actually, before I get to that, I'll note that down. But before I get to that, I did want to hear the sort of the more long-term problems as well.
Yeah.
So I sorry I interrupted. I am interested in that as well.
No, all good. And I just made a note for myself so I remember to go back to it later as well. So thank you. The bigger problem, and this gets at like the reason that like I do the stuff I do on my channel,
Mm,
pointing out that creationism is pseudoscience. It's not just pseudoscience, but it's bad science and it's wrong. And here's how and why, and how you can understand how and why. The bigger problem with removing evolution from like a biology education in general is that it plays into or promotes this general anti-science approach to the world. And
mhm.
when it comes to evolution, you can look at that like, yeah, there are going to be like kind of small scale consequences to that, like talk about like
Sure.
antibiotic resistance, right? Like we can only
Yeah.
understand that in the context of evolution. And we can
Yep.
we can like, for example, do experiments and predict specifically what mutations are going to occur and accumulate in a specific order based on experiments where we can see how they interact with each other and say, okay, this combination will work, this combination will not. Let's prepare to see this one in the real world at some point
Right.
in the future, right? And that's a thing we've done where we've experimentally evolved novel forms of resistance and then years later saw those forms pop up in nature separately. Like that
Mhm.
is a thing
Mhm.
we have done that has informed drug treatments for infections, right? So yes, you lose that kind of thing, but the bigger problem is you take the evolution out of it, you're promoting an anti-science, not just an anti-science kind of body of knowledge, but an anti-science way of thinking that's going to have knock-on effects. Because you end up, if you reject this body of work for these very bad reasons, then that way of thinking tends to bleed over into other things. And an example of this that we saw just over the past few years is how young Earth creationism was highly correlated with an anti vaccine attitude in response to the
Right.
COVID pandemic, right?
Yep.
And there were even a number of very prominent professional creationists with like advanced degrees who died of COVID
Mm.
having refused to get vaccinated. And like there's this kind of domino, this pseudoscience domino effect where once you believe
Mm.
one thing that's not true, it makes it easier to believe a whole bunch of other things that are not true.
Mm.
And in the short term, like if someone believes the world is 6,000 years old, is that like actually dangerous? In a vacuum, no. But it's training their brain to believe that vaccines are bad and dangerous and climate change isn't a real thing and right and a whole bunch of other things that actually
Yep.
are
Yep.
dangerous and bad, right?
Yep.
That's the big thing. Once you kind of open that door to like, well, we'll let this little bit of anti-science in, that door just gets kicked right down and all the rest follows through.
Right. Right. And so and I've noticed the correlation between young Earth creationists and sort of flat earthers kind of thing. Like they're almost to a person, they're young Earth creationists. Um,
Yep.
Do you think that it actually surprised me the amount of young Earth creationists that is in the US? It's something like 38%. I think I saw that actually shocked me when I first learned about it. That was a 2017 study by Gallup poll, so it isn't that close. But a USA Today poll said 4 in 10, or roughly about the same amount, about 40%, are young Earth creationists. Why do you think it is that America, which has always been so cutting edge of science and sort of so innovative, suddenly, like, and I must admit, sort of, this is the lowest point it's been for a while, but why do you think this one thing just keeps holding on, and these ideas keep holding on when you compare it to Europe, which has sort of, it's single digits in most countries of people that believe in young Earth creationism?
Yeah, so I think there's like the kind of more I don't know what the right word would be for that. There's kind of two ways to answer this. There's the more like kind of historical view of like, America was largely founded by like kind of religious minorities that were trying to achieve some degree of religious freedom. So you had throughout US history, Puritans and such, and you had like these very religious communities. And, the US society is largely built out of that. And we're still kind of in that zone culturally. And you can look through like the 1800s and the 1900s waves of religious restoration. But I don't buy that. I don't think that's a good explanation. I think the answer is much simpler and much more cynical than that. I really think that if you look at, because the modern creationism, and specifically young Earth creationism, is a very recent thing. We're talking, decades rather than centuries, right? We're talking like 1960s is really when this stuff starts to like come back in a big way, like the modern incarnation of the young Earth movement. And it really is wrapped up in like right-wing politics. And like, it sounds super cynical and like a cop-out answer, but like, folks, that really is the answer. It really is the same kind of thing as like, why is abortion such a big thing in the United States? The answer to that is because religious conservatives needed something else to latch onto when they lost the battle over segregation in the 60s and 70s. And the thing they latched onto was abortion. And in the same way, like young Earth creationism is a part of that. It's this right-wing, very specific form of politicized Christianity in the United States. And it's out of that where we get the modern young Earth movement. And most of the people who believe, like in these surveys, the wording is something, it's very vague, right? It's like, which of the following best, describes your belief? And the option that ends up with like 35 to 40% is humans were created in their current form within the last 10,000 years, right? That's approximates the wording. And the 35 or 40% that pick that, most of the people who do that are not like thinking, oh yeah, Ken Ham, AIG, yeah, like, and all the other things that kind of go along with that. But that's the political milieu that belief comes out of and where it is promoted from. Most of the people that buy it are not the ones who are like enmeshed in the source material. But it filters down through many layers, through all the schools and the churches, and that's what people end up believing. But it really is first and foremost a political thing, and the religious aspect to it is secondary, and the science aspect to it, if we dig down deep enough, doesn't even rate, right? Like, you think Ken Ham cares about the, like, he doesn't care. It's not what it's about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, he did do that famous debate with Bill Nye, so I think he cares that the science doesn't back him, but I don't think he cares that the science is true or not. He just wants his belief to be true. Like, so I sort of agree that he cares insofar as he would like it to back him, and it doesn't, because he seems to have a big problem with it.
Yeah.
But going back to that evaluation assessment, I saw a conversation you had with Paul Price, who I've also debated on sort of more philosophical stuff. But it was very strange when you were asking him to quantify things, and he just was sort of saying, well, you can't quantify that, you can't evaluate it. And we've also noticed a real failure in definitions, sort of, so kinds, for instance, and we never get any kind
Right.
of definition for it. What is it about creationism that has these real funny, or what about it, in your opinion, is they have these real funny definitions? Do you think it's just a lack of definitions? Do you think they're dishonestly going, hey, we can't say this or else we're going to be pinned down to something?
Oh, it's so in at least some cases, it is 100% the second thing.
Mhm.
And I know that that's the case because they have said it in writing, like, this is what we do. And
Right.
the example I go to this is with fitness, right? The concept of
Yes. Yep.
evolutionary fitness, which, for people who aren't familiar, the concept of fitness and evolution basically is, if you look at a population of individuals, you can evaluate the fitness of each member of that population. And fitness is basically what is the representation of their genes, their genomic content in the next generation, right? What is your relative contribution genetically to the next generation? That's your fitness, right? How much genetically are you contributing to subsequent generations? Now, in evolutionary biology, there's a bunch of ways you can like quantify that depending on the specific context you're looking. But
Right.
like, that's what fitness is, right? It's within a population, each individual, they're competing for resources. Your relative contribution represents your fitness. The more kids you have, the more copies of your genome are out there, the higher your
Hmm.
fitness. Now,
Yep.
in creationism, they want to redefine that. I'm going to take a second while I'm talking here to pull up the
Okay.
specific article. And it's really easy. I should be able to find it quickly because I remember the URL, because it's a very simple URL. Yeah, it's creation.com/fitness. And it's by Paul Price and
Mhm.
Dr. Rob Carter. And this is a piece they wrote together a bunch of years ago about fitness and genetic entropy, related concepts, and basically how we need to redefine the concept of fitness. And they really tip their hand with the end of this article. So I'm going to read this quote to everybody here. It says, only when we insist that the terms of the debate be fair and accurate will we have any chance to clearly communicate the truth of creation and the bankruptcy of Darwinism to the world at large. As we have undertaken to here we go. As we have undertaken to demonstrate here, yeah, there it is on screen. Perfect. As we've undertaken to demonstrate here, it is time. Evolutionists have been guilty of hiding behind the misleading use of the term fitness. It is now time for honest scientists to adopt a more realistic, objective look at the parameters of life. When one does this, the pictures are bleak. We are all dying a slow death of genetic decay, blah, 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 blah. So they're not hiding the ball
Mm.
here. They're saying, look, we need to redefine this term. When we
Right.
redefine the term, we creationists can win the debate. Okay, but
Yeah.
like, that's not what that word means, guys. Like, that's
Yeah.
not what it means.
That's sort of just uh, well, then you're not winning the debate with the term that the other person is using. You're then changing the term and winning some other debate, because it would be like defining God as, whatever started the universe, and saying, well, I've won the God debate. Yeah, but we're not talking about
Okay,
the same thing at that point.
right.
We're talking about two different things. Um, I just want to point out that creation ministry, I'm not sure if it's creation ministry, but one of them has their mission statement is to basically prove God. Essentially, that's their entire mission statement. That's what they do.
I'm
I
sure
do.
I'm sure they have one. AIG is the infamous one that not only do
Yeah,
they
yeah.
have their statement of faith, but all the employees have to sign on to it and are not allowed to publicly
Mhm.
disagree with the statement of
Yeah.
faith, the ministry statement of faith. Yeah.
Right, right. So, there's I sort of compare it when you're sort of, I think I compared it in one debate to the Geological Society, which has, to understand the world around us and to investigate the natural world, that kind of stuff, to basically uphold the Bible. Those are two different goals on their lines, kind of thing. But we're sort of seeing a lot of attacks, as you've noticed, on sort of evolutionary biology, especially, sort of saying we want it out of unis, trying to attack it in all of these classes, and it's been going on for some time. I admire that you attack back. I notice you haven't done a lot of debates, but you have been debating. You've been, having people like Paul Price, who wrote that article, on to discuss with him, and
Right.
that was an amazing interview. I'm going to link Dan's channel in the chat again. I highly recommend it. Yeah, I love being in the lives. The time frame is terrible for me, but that's okay.
I know. I'm sorry. Working around my schedule. I appreciate you making it work for me.
How dare you not be on Australian time?
We are in different time zones, to say the least.
Totally fair. Totally fair. But why is it that they sort of, all they do is attack the scientific sort of institutions on evolution and things? Why doesn't science counter back? Why isn't science really doing things to say, hey, this is pseudoscience, do not listen to this? Why is it that it's left up to individuals like yourself instead of institutions? Because I look at you and I'm like, well, obviously we're doing our best. I'm doing my best to sort of listen to the science and communicate that as best as I can, and so are you, and so is everybody else that I know. But you've got these massive institutions and they seem way overfunded.
Right. Yeah.
We have scientific institutions, but they don't do that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think the simplest reason is that, and this is my experience in evolutionary biology, like I would mention to people, in grad school, right? My colleagues of like, about this dude who works at AIG, he's got a PhD, but he does the phylogenetics all wrong. You guys hear about this guy? And they'd be like, no, what are you talking about? Like, you pay attention to those people? Like, there's this idea of like, though they're cranks, they're not doing science, we don't have to pay attention to them. And, I kind of like, for a while I could see the merits of that, but I think like that view of how to approach like anti-science organizations like Answers in Genesis, the ignore them and they'll go away, is just wrong. And I think that's been shown to be wrong, where you have to actively push back. But I think a lot of the field, whether it's evolution or other fields that are being attacked by, anti-science forces, climate science is a really good example of this, where they're basically saying, one, they're not doing actual science. There's just nonsense. So I can ignore it. And two, we don't want to look political. We just want to be able to do our science. And that second point, what everyone has to acknowledge, anyone working in science, no matter what it is, what you have to acknowledge is you may not want to get involved in the politics of the science you do, but you are. That's, you don't get to opt out of that, right? There's a political aspect to every branch of science, no matter what it is. There's a political aspect to it. So everyone in the field really ought to be paying attention to this stuff and just kind of like keep in the back of your mind as you're going about doing whatever it is you're doing. And, I think, for example, the climate science community has gotten really burned by this over the years, right? Because what you're finding is really, talk about well-funded right-wing attacks, right? Like climate science is ground zero for that. You've gotten people whose reputations have been ruined, whose emails have been hacked, all this stuff in the service of making it look like the work they're doing is the pseudoscience and the anti-science forces opposing them have the real science, right? And I think like the evolutionary community, to the extent they're aware of the creationist organizations out there, don't want to get sucked into kind of the same politicized atmosphere that climate science as a field just operates under. Which, like, fair enough, but like, you don't have a choice. Like, you're in it, whether you volunteer to participate in that political side of things or not, like you are. So we need to acknowledge it and like approach it head on.
Well, I think, Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, who's obviously, obviously he's the most famous evolutionary biologist on the planet. I don't think that's arguable. But he sort of said he's not doing sort of debate anymore, kind of thing. He's not taking them on anymore.
Right.
He sort of says, well, it's lending them credibility, it's lending them a platform. I personally don't think so. I think he's just tired of talking to them, to be honest with you. But what were your thoughts on that? Because I was talking to Jay Bundy, who I love, Dr. Jay Bundy. He's fantastic. I think he did a stream that I caught with Gutsick Gibbon and Dr. Jay Bundy, and I think it was Grayson was on as well, which is some of my favorite people.
There was that long fundraising stream that they did for Doc Dino's trip. That's right. I was on there for a bit. Jordan from Reasons of Doubt was on there. That was a fun panel. That was a great time. Yeah. I talked to Dr. Bundy just last week, 2 weeks ago on my channel. I had him on. We had a really
I saw that. Yeah.
So go ahead.
He sort of said that most of his colleagues sort of said, don't put yourself out there, don't do this channel, don't debate them. Did you get the same reception that you shouldn't be in this sphere, you shouldn't be?
No, I think because so I didn't have this channel until 2020. It kind of started as a pandemic hobby with my science nerd friends from Reddit, who
sure.
It was we all met and hung out on Reddit. It was Gutsick Gibbon was one of them, and who are the other people in there? I don't know if you know TD Lane, but he pops up in people's streams occasionally. Mr. Wilford on the geology front. So we were all hanging out, and then kind of got dragged into the YouTube thing, and then people were like, you should have your own channel. I said, okay, sure, I'll have my own channel. But at that point, it was lockdown, so who knows, right? But then sure. I'm not in grad school anymore. I'm full-time teaching, so I'm not as visible in real life scientific community as I was in grad school. So I have not gotten that feedback, but I know I was talking to Jay gets that feedback, like, what are you doing this? And I've changed my mind on this, because for a long time I was in the don't give them oxygen camp. I totally see the rationale of that argument, but here's the thing, that didn't work. We tried that and it failed.
Yes, and then we ended up with an arc in some random state,
exactly.
But here's the thing, I really, it does concern me that the weighing up between giving them oxygen in a platform or letting them form echo chambers where they never hear anything different. And I do have to fall onto the side of, at least you have a voice that is dissenting in there. That shows that not everybody agrees with them. Does it bewilder you when you hear statements like, more and more evolutionary biologists are coming over to young Earth creationism?
Yeah, I just going back 1 second is you're exactly right. Is that the sad truth is, I think scientists have an inflated view of our importance as gatekeepers of the discourse, and by oh, we don't want to give them oxygen by debating them. My friends, they have plenty of oxygen without you.
Oh,
they have for your average evolutionary biologist, the people who work for the big creationist ministries, the creationist YouTubers who are just randos on the internet who do YouTube, apologetics stuff, they have way more oxygen in terms of their reach than the average evolutionary biologist. We're not doing them any favors by debating them, okay, folks? We need to get out of that mindset. That's not how it works. So you're exactly right when you say you need to be in the room countering it, because the fact of the matter is they're going to have the platform, right? That's not going away. The question is, do they have the platform uncontested, or do people hear the accurate information alongside the misinformation? And if that's the reality, then it's way better to make sure that somebody's in there to provide the accurate information. Now, that was going back to a thing you said a second ago. I apologize. What was that last thing you asked? Because that was really interesting too.
Okay, now I've totally forgotten. I'm thinking about
well, you know what? That's what YouTube is for.
That's all right. That's my fault. Absolutely my fault. No, I've
Oh,
lost
I
it.
got it. It was, you asked, does it bewilder you when you hear that like uh, evolution is losing ground, it's theory in crisis, more and more
Yes,
people. Yeah,
yes. Yeah.
I find that hilarious every time I hear it from a
Mhm.
creationist organization, because like you hear this from like Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson from Answers in Genesis. He did a
Right, right.
series of interviews lately on some AIG podcast, and one of the things he said in one of them was something along the lines of, and he said this in other places too, it's kind of one of his lines, is like, for a long time, the evolutionists, they've been asking us questions, but now we're forcing them to answer our questions. And it's
Mm.
like, my man, 99% of evolutionary biologists have no idea who you are. Like, nobody knows what you do.
Right.
Nobody pays attention to you.
Mhm.
You are doing nothing in terms of like
Yeah.
forcing evolutionary biologists to take note. No, you're not. Nobody knows who you are. Like
Yeah, no
that
one's
in
holding their feet to the fire, yeah.
Yeah, like in that regard, creationism is this tiny irrelevant thing that the fields can ignore because they don't submit anything for peer review. They don't even like collect their own data. Like Nathaniel Jeanson, for people who don't know this guy, he's got a PhD from
Mm.
Harvard. And afterwards, after he graduated, he basically said, like straight up, like, yeah, I said the words I needed to say to get the degree so I could then misrepresent the field
Mm.
using my credentials to back up what I'm saying. He just straight up said this, like after he
Yeah, yeah.
got hired. And like, so he's out there, but he's not doing any actual science. He's not like collecting data. He's not, running any simulations. He's not doing any experiments. This guy just basically peruses other people's papers to take their data and then misrepresent it in a way that is
Right.
useful for him, right? That's what
Mhm.
he does. He's not trying to get any novel research published. He's not trying even to something else you can do is people publish something and you go, hey, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. And then you dig into the data and publish a rebuttal to that. He's not even doing that, right? He's just manipulating data that people have collected so he can use it to promote young earth creationism. That's all he's doing.
So
It's irrelevant
Ja
to the field.
so Jensen doesn't even try to he doesn't try to get his ideas through, he doesn't even bother kind of thing, he doesn't
Doesn't
even
even try.
but he does write books.
He's written a couple books, and
Yeah.
he has papers published in Answers Research Journal, although his output has slowed as he's kind of transitioned more to the book writing thing.
Mhm.
But Answers Research Journal likes to pretend to be a peer-reviewed, scientific journal, but it's not. It's LARPing peer review. It's young Earth creationists just scratching each other's back, right? It's
Mm.
an Answers in Genesis blog with an editor. It's not an actual
Yeah.
research journal in any sense of the word. He's not putting and not, let's say it was. Let's say the peer review was totally legit. No real biologist read Answers Research Journal. So if you want to
Mhm.
like take the field by storm, that's not the way to do it. You have to try to get published in real journals where you're going to encounter other people in the field who are going to disagree with you. That's how you're going to change minds. Not
Well,
interested.
yeah, and I've seen the sort of people that quote articles from those journals. I'm using that word very very loosely to describe that the answers in Genesis. I think they call it Answers Journal or something like that, trying to be a scientific journal. Does that concern you, or is it just sort of sort of hilarious that they think they're going to get credibility
Yeah,
by just shouting about it?
it's a PR thing. It's not like they're not going to get credibility in the field. What it is it's a PR thing to make their own, people who are already in the fold feel
Mhm.
good about it and feel like they have something as a scientific foundation for the belief, right? There's no attempt to get anything published in Answers Research Journal or
Mm.
I think there's a Journal of Creation, and then there's the Discovery Institute, the intelligent design think tank. They have their own
Yeah.
called Biocomplexity, is their kind of in-house journal. But again, it's this kind of thing where it's like the editors, the reviewers, and the authors are all the same people,
Mm.
and it's just this
Yeah.
in-house kind of little operation. Um, no, nothing that they're doing in those journals like they're not making any attempt to broaden the audience to present. They're not even like,
Right.
I'm going to present this at a like every year there's evolution conferences. You could just like
Hmm.
submit this work and present it to a room full of evolutionary biologists. If you really
Yeah.
thought it could stand on its own 2 feet and you got the goods and you're going to convince people that you're right, there are things you would be doing, and they're doing none of those things.
Well, annoyingly, they've sort of come up with their own conferences as well. Sort of,
Yeah.
I believe genetic entropy was presented at a conference, and I really have issues with the way that they're misrepresenting Kimura's work and sort of just redefining what things are essentially. Um, is that sort of the biggest issue at the moment, is the genetic entropy thing? What do you think is the biggest
Man,
sort of
yeah.
problem child from the creationists at the moment?
It's, it's so funny because it fluctuates. It's like things come and go in and out of style, but they don't actually come up with new arguments. So there have been times where like genetic entropy is like the big thing for like 6 months or a year. Like that's the thing that a bunch of people are talking about. And there'll be other
Yeah.
times like when Jeanson came out with Traced, his book from 20
Yes.
whatever year that was, 2022, maybe. I think it was 2022.
Hmm.
Jeanson came out with Traced, which was all about the Y chromosome and human ancestry and how it aligns with the Bible and whatever. And so things like mutation rates and substitution rates and Y chromosome phylogenetics, like that was the thing for a solid like 6 months. Just like if you were talking about evolution and creationism, that was one of the things that was just floating around as a big topic. Junk DNA is another one that comes and goes, right? Every now and then you get a
Yeah.
paper
Yeah.
published, and then junk DNA flares up for a few months. But
Mm.
once you've been like doing it for a few years, you start to see that it's just the same stuff over and over again.
Right.
Like this is a problem I'm running into on my channel because now I've been going for over 4 years. I started in like I think like June of
Hmm.
2020. And I've like the main thing that I do is the series that I call Creation Myths, which is just like
Yep.
this claim, that claim, this claim.
Yep.
And I have like 20 something, maybe 30 videos in that series. And I'm like running out of things to cover because they're not constantly coming up with new things. There's a finite universe of claims that they make, and they just cycle
Mm.
through them. So even things that sound new, I can be like, hey, here's this thing they came up with. But if you follow this back down, it's actually this other thing, which we already covered that. So I'll just give you the
So
quick version, right? And it's
refer
done.
to my video from 2 years ago where they did
Right. And it,
exactly the same argument. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think Erica got to mention that one, that you'll sort of slap down this ridiculous argument, and then they'll shift to something else, and then it'll be back, a few months later in a new sort of
yep.
slightly changed form. I kind of see that when I debate as well, but what I've noticed is that they sort of the new stuff is the apologetics or the explanations explaining away new things that the biologists have discovered. Like they'll discover, say, the Nilanase, sort of organism, for instance, and then they'll sort of explain why that is, and that's what's new. They don't really have any, they don't discover anything for themselves. They don't add to our knowledge at all. All they do is accommodate what other people have found into their sort of paradigm of, well, God did everything. And that's what I've noticed. That's the new stuff. But yeah,
And it's interesting you said that because there's kind of two ways that we see that they handle kind of I don't know if new discoveries are the word, but new publications that are
yeah, yeah.
explaining a certain thing. And kind of the two ways are that one, you could have the accommodationists, right? That'll basically say, oh, well, that's fine. That's
Mm,
consistent with special creation. And then you have the deniers who are like, nope, that's wrong. That did not happen at all. And the really funny thing to watch, if for everybody watching, when something new and interesting comes onto the scene, like, oh, we found a new fossil, right? A new hominin fossil that explains the evolution, the chosen intermediate state for the knee joint, right? To just like make up an example, right?
mm.
uh, when something like that happens, keep an eye on the various creation ministries for a couple of months afterwards, because they're arguing amongst themselves over what the party line should be. And oftentimes they'll
Right.
end up kind of okay, we all agree this is, we're gonna say nope,
Mhm.
that's fake, whatever, right? So, like for example, with certain hominin fossils, they can't acknowledge that it's a real skeleton, so they have to say it's a chimera of multiple species with the bones intermixed together, right?
Of
And that's
course, yeah,
like
of course.
the party line. But then for other ones, which is really funny, they'll end up disagreeing with each other. So, like for
Mm,
example, you've got some creationist organizations who are cool with dinosaurs with feathers. They're just like,
yeah,
that is a thing that exists. Like dinosaurs had feathers, that is a thing.
yep,
Others will say, nope, not no way, not no how. If it had feathers, it's a bird, it's not a dinosaur, the end. That is not a thing. And like, so you'll have these weird
mm,
moments of dissonance between the young earth organizations where they'll take one specific research finding and they'll handle it in radically different ways.
right.
And
And
that's always really funny.
I think the big one was whether Australopithecus was a human or not,
Yeah.
and sort of half of them said, "Hey, it's a human that is corrupted or something," and half of them said, "No, it's just an ape and it never walked upright." So you're sort of going, you have to ask before you engage with that question, like, do you think Australopithecines were actually
Yeah.
humans or apes?
Is it okay if I share my screen? I have a
Oh, of
great
course, of
it's so
course.
funny that you use that example for this point because there's this wonderful table that somebody made. I don't know when. Um, but let me just show you this amazing table. Basically, what this shows is you have along the left, you have a number of specimens of skulls. And
Mhm.
across the top, you have a bunch of creationist publications attempts to classify these various skulls as either fully chimp or fully Homo sapien.
Right.
And you can see that there is robust disagreement over whether any given specimen, is it an ape or is it a human? Some of them, there's more consensus than others. Some of them are like 50-50 down the middle. Creationists
Yep.
can't agree on these. But the great thing is that every one of these creationist authors will say that every specimen we have is either fully ape or fully
Right.
human. But then
Right.
over just a few decades, they can't agree on which ones are which.
Mhm. And
Okay.
I think that, yeah, and it really does show that they're and sort of something I want to bring up is that their methodology is so um, it's so inconsistent, and this is something I've brought up in debate after debate, sort of intellectual inconsistency, where you say, "Hey, all of this information leads to my conclusion," but when you apply it to something else, it doesn't. Do you think that's why they don't like to sort of quantify anything or define anything properly? Is it because that? Do you think it's intentional? Or do you think it's that cognitive dissonance to no, I don't want to apply this equally across the board, or else I'm going to lose my mind?
I that is a question that I've wrestled with for years, and I keep going
Mm,
back and forth on the answer. And there are certain moments where I'm like, "You're just lying, and clearly you're lying, and I know you're lying, and everyone knows, and you're lying to yourself." And then there are other moments where I'll think, "No, like you clearly think that you're on the level here, even though it's completely inconsistent from month to month, sometimes day to day." And
mhm.
I, there are some creationists that I have a very low opinion of, and this list is getting longer by the month. That like my take is like they know, like they know, and they're just saying what they need
Mm.
to say at any given moment, like they know. And there are other creationists that I think genuinely grapple with this, and to their credit, like try to figure this stuff out. And specifically, I'm thinking about Todd Wood and his group. Um, like Peter with Paleo Logos, for an example, kind
Yes,
of
yeah.
that whole crew. If you look at their output, for example, like they do a lot of that, like baraminology stuff, like what are the created kinds, trying to find objective ways of looking at these specimens and drawing the lines. And they do try to be consistent about it, much to
Mhm.
the chagrin of other young earth creationists who, exactly as you say, don't like the level of specificity in their work, because once you like
Yeah.
pin down a metric or a definition or something, now you open yourself up to falsification, which
Mhm.
in real science, that's the name of the game. If you don't do that, you're not participating. In creationism, that is the exception, right? The
Yeah.
vast majority of what we see is just vague enough so that it really is unfalsifiable in practice, and you can't actually find something that you couldn't accommodate into this concept or that concept. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of creationists are towing that line out of like necessity to be comfortable in their own shoes and in their own mind, right?
Right.
I think you have a few that are just like, if I may, they're just BS artists. And like, I think there's a bunch
Sure.
of those.
Yeah.
But I think there's a probably proportionally larger group who have convinced themselves that these inconsistencies are actually not inconsistencies and you can actually reconcile them.
Well, it's an interesting question. It's kind of, when does willful ignorance become lying, and
Yeah.
lying to yourself? If you never actually think about, whether you're being inconsistent or whether you're applying something across the board and you won't do it because that makes you uncomfortable, is that dishonest? Yes. Is it lying? I don't know about that one. You
Right.
know, I
If there's specific data you won't collect or specific measurements
right.
you won't take, specific hypotheses you won't explore,
Mm,
specifically because you think it may result in inconsistencies in positions you have taken, right? That
yeah.
is a dishonest approach to the endeavor. Um,
Mhm,
does it meet the threshold of just like straight up lying?
yeah.
That's where the line gets very fuzzy, and I think a lot of that you have to look at the qualifications of the person who's doing it, right? I think so. Like
Whether they
somebody
should
like
know better.
yeah, like Nathaniel
Mm,
Jeanson, this dude's got a PhD. Like, there's a lot of these guys have PhDs.
yeah. Stanford.
Nathaniel Jeanson, Georgia Purdom, Rob Carter, like Michael Behe, like yeah, they know
Yeah,
how well
Sanford's one that should know
he
better.
should
Like,
know, right? He
yeah,
should know, right? And then there's other people who are not specialists in the field and they're still kind of doing this stuff professionally, semi-professionally, or on an
uh,
amateur basis.
yeah, like
And
Stephen C. Meyer, for instance, who, you know, has no
I
business.
I still put him in the professional group. He's a Discovery Institute guy going way back.
But I mean, I saw a thing on when he was asked about the cosmology of the universe, and the man has a sort of undergraduate in physics, and I think he does history. And it's like, why would you be asking him? Then again,
Yeah,
they went on to ask Richard Dawkins about the origins of the universe, and he's sort of like, well, experts say this, and they want, oh no, we want your
yeah.
explanation. It's like,
But
he's an evolutionary
I don't
biologist.
matter. Like, why don't you ask a
Yeah,
plumber what he thinks, right? It's the same. You could ask
yeah,
me what I think about the origins of the universe. My opinion is just as valid as my 6-year-old's because you know what?
yes,
Neither one of us are an expert in that field. So, like,
right, right.
you know,
It's baffling, but what is more baffling, and I did want to talk about this, is the lending of, they'll have a historian comment on geology, or
uh-huh.
a geologist comment on sort of evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know why they do this. Do you have any idea? What, and the guy that you're talking about, Paul Price, as far as I know, he's a philosophy guy. He's got a doctorate in philosophy or something.
Oh,
I
Paul
don't.
Paul Price doesn't have any graduate
Oh, he doesn't.
degrees at all. No, maybe he has a
Oh, okay.
master's in something, but I know. I mean, Paul Price, I mean, he's written for Creation Ministries International. He's written for Answers in Genesis, but like his thing is like supply chain management or something. Like he's not
Oh, okay.
in this. This is not his thing, right? But you're absolutely
Mhm.
right. There's this weird phenomenon where, like, I just this year I had this whole months long thing with Discovery Institute about junk DNA, which is a whole thing, and which creatures love to talk about junk DNA.
Yeah.
But I ended up having a debate, which I don't do many debates, but I had a debate with a guy, Dr. Casey Luskin. So a legitimate PhD, works for
Mhm.
Discovery Institute. Um, they have biologists on staff. They've got Dr. Michael Behe, Dr. Douglas Axe. Um, I think they have a couple other people who have graduate degrees in life science fields.
Yep.
Casey Luskin has a PhD in geology. Why am I talking to him about a topic in genetics. Why is it not one of the biologists that's doing this? I don't know. I don't know. Right? I mean, Gunther
Well,
Beckley writes for them. He's like a
yeah.
paleontologist, but that would be closer. That would be
Mm,
closer to the field. I don't know, but this is absolutely a thing, and it works in the other direction too. So you'll notice this on YouTube, for example, where like the example of this that I can think of that I always think is funny is our mutual friend Standing for Truth, right? Um,
oh, Donnie, yeah.
I have gone on there and like I'm an evolutionary biologist and a geneticist, like that's my expertise, right? And they're on there asking
Yep.
me about fossils. I don't know, not my field, right?
Yeah.
But then
Yeah.
Erica Guts at Gibbon will go on and they'll be asking her about genetic stuff. And she'll be like, I'm not a geneticist, I'm a paleoanthropologist. I can tell you all about the
Yeah.
skeletal morphology and the trade, right? Like they want to put people outside of their own field, but also present their
Yeah.
experts in a field where they don't have training. And it
Expertise. Right.
strikes me as the whole exercise is dishonest at the end of the day. Like that whole approach to the conversation is dishonest. If you
Mm.
have a biochemist and a geologist and you're making an argument about how a cell works, the biochemist is the one that needs to be having that conversation, not the
Right.
geologist.
Right. Absolutely. It seems to happen all the time as well. And I mean, I know
All the
that you
time.
did a debate against Mr. Badinsky about, I think it was about a few months ago, a year ago, maybe. Time flies, but that was on chromosome 2 fusion, I believe. But
Yeah, we talked about that a
sort
bit.
of,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't. It's kind of weird that I mean, Donnie. I've never. And here's the thing: in spite of myself, I like the guy. He's a likable guy, but he wrote this book on viruses,
I have a bunch of his books
retroviruses.
back there.
Yeah, so but he has absolutely no credentials to be doing so whatsoever. And the paper that he leans on heavily, which is the switching sites, how endogenous retroviruses can be co-opted by
Yeah.
mutation to
Yeah, it's a real
help
thing.
us.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah,
It's a real
and
thing.
sort of
Absolutely.
he uses that paper to point out how they're designed by God, which is so baffling to me
Yeah.
that he's using a paper that says, "Hey, there's a natural process that creates that endogenous retroviruses get assimilated into our genetic code," and he uses that to say the exact opposite.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on, because it happens all the time, this misrepresentation
Oh
of
yeah.
papers?
All the time. That's where you get into what is clearly dishonesty, I think. And you could see tons of examples of this among the younger creationists. The virus paper is a really good example because that
Yeah,
paper is a really good read. And not
yeah,
only is it a really good paper in terms of like showing what the authors intend for it to show, it's also really well written, I think, in terms of being a very accessible read. It's, they very clearly lay out here's this process and here's how
yeah.
we know. And it's
Hmm.
that second part that here's how we know that
Yeah,
makes it so good because like you can point out examples of where this process called endogenization, where this process
yeah.
of endogenization is happening in real time right now in natural
Mm.
populations. How do we know? Because we can see it happening. Here's examples that are at different stages of this process. So they made a hypothesis, right? Here's what this process ought to look like. If this is the process, we can go
Hmm.
out in the real world because everything gets infected by these viruses. We can go out in the
Yeah.
real world and find real life populations that are at different stages of that process. And lo and behold, that's what we find. That is beautifully done work.
Mm.
Creationists take that and go, change sides. They help you. The host can steal them and use them for whatever. God must have put them there. That is
Yeah.
180 degrees from what that paper shows. And that's one of just, another example is that famous paper of it's the barcoding paper, the why should mitochondria define a species paper,
Hmm.
which young earth creationists love this one because what the authors shown. That paper is the opposite. That is a terrible paper. There's so many problems with that paper, but let's ignore all of them. Let's assume that paper is good. What the authors claim is mitochondrial DNA among animals shows that most animal species, the vast majority of animal species that they surveyed, are relatively young. They appeared within the last 200,000 years, all different times within that time frame, but within the last 200,000 years, and experienced a population bottleneck of the mitochondrial genome somewhere since they became kind of distinct species. And creationists take this paper to say, aha, that's, when everyone went through a bottleneck was the flood 4,000 years ago. But like, guys, the paper has the math to get the time frame in it, and it's 200,000 years. Like, you can't just take the bottleneck part of the paper and ignore the 200,000 years part of the paper.
Well, apparently you can.
Right, but you're lying. You're just lying about it at that point. Absolutely, but like this is not something that just the amateurs do. This is the professionals do this. Nathaniel Jeanson, for his book Traced, one of the papers he leans on, he did this amazing thing. Have you ever seen this? Where it's this paper he takes, and it's a phylogenetic. It's a small phylogenetic tree, small number of individuals, and at the very tips of the branches, there's like on a bunch of the branches, it's just like, and it's a split and two very short lines. And he correctly deduced from that little bit is a father and a son, right? That represents a father and son.
Yep.
So what he does, and on that figure, there's a scale bar, right, for the length of the branches representing the number of mutations. So what he does is he does like a CSI zoom and enhance, and he takes the scale bar and the lengths of those branches and then extracts from that the number of mutations separating the father-son pairs.
Wait, isn't that just a diagram? Like, it's just a graphical representation.
Yeah.
It doesn't...
It's that the branch lengths are proportional to the number of mutations. So he's like, oh, if I zoom in a lot, because like the bar will be like, this bar is 10 mutations. And then these short little branches, and it'll be like, oh, that one's 1, that one's 2, that one's 3, that one's 2. So he uses the scale bar to, like, he's literally doing the ratios of pixels in the figure. But then the authors of that paper pointed out that, no, you can't actually do that, because since we weren't doing like the sequencing, we were looking for large scale changes like a deletion or a translocation or something.
Sure.
When you do, for everyone who like has never done DNA sequencing, which is the vast majority of people, you should know that when you do DNA sequencing, the raw readout you get back is not your sequence. There's errors in that. It's messy. It's noisy. You have to correct it. Like, there's going to be, like, we know that there's errors in the methodology that you have to account for. Well, in that particular paper that Jeanson uses, because the authors didn't care about the specific sequence, they didn't do any of the error correcting. So the number of variations that make those father-son pairs different from each other is within the error rate of the methodology. So the errors that Jeanson is using as the base, the mutations that he's using as the basis for literally a whole book may just be experimental error, uncorrected. And they may not actually be real mutations at all. And like,
so he's counting the errors in gathering the data as mutations,
as actual data. Yeah. And like the authors have said, here's the methodology we used. Here are the steps we didn't do. Therefore, these sequences are actually unreliable and you can't use them at that level of precision. But he just blows that off and says, no, I'm going to use them anyway. Like, this is a dude with a PhD from Harvard. Like, he's lying. Like, he knows, he understands that what he's doing is wrong.
Well, wasn't Jeanson also the one that Erica did a video on when he used a bad copy of the
that was Tompkins.
That was Tompkins. Yeah,
that was Tompkins. Yeah. Who's also should know better. He is a PhD in, I think what is his field? I don't remember his field. It may be genetics. Like, he should know better. Yeah, that's same thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what would your favorite argument for evolution be? What would you think is the strongest one? Or do you look at them and sort of it's all the different fields coming together kind of thing?
Yes, but also I have a favorite thing. And it's a little bit it's a little bit complicated. I'm going to try to explain it. It's not a simple thing, but if you ask me, what's the single data set that like shows that evolution is true? Not like that we understand evolutionary theory or how the processes work, but just like it is true that all cellular life on Earth goes back to a common ancestor like 4-ish billion years ago, right? The data set that shows that, the argument you make is you look at DNA sequences that are what we call, they're unconstrained, meaning there's no natural selection operating on them. So they can change just all willy-nilly with no cost to the organism, right? So like our genes that make specific enzymes and things that we need, those are highly constrained. If you have a mutation and it breaks the enzyme, like that's bad. A lot of those will kill you, right? So obviously that mutation doesn't persist. But there's huge swaths of our genome that don't have specific functions. The sequence doesn't actually matter. So mutations there just like build up at whatever random frequency the mutations occur. And you can look at those parts of the genome and construct a nested hierarchy of cellular life. So like the humans and the chimps and the gorillas and, the mammals and the vertebrates and the animals and the opisthocons, right? And you can get broader and broader and broader using the comparisons of these unconstrained regions. And the reason that matters is that what you hear when you look at you can do the same thing with like genes, for example, right? Well, what you hear from creationists is, oh, well, but God created them that way. And, humans and chimps are most similar. So their genes are the most similar, right? And that explains the similarity. Okay, but what about the parts of the genome that don't do anything? What about the parts that don't have any functional significance? Those, and actually I shouldn't even say it that way because it's independent of function. Because people argue about function versus junk DNA. I shouldn't have even said it that way. It's that the regions are unconstrained, and that's not up for debate because we can just empirically measure the rate of mutation accumulation and show that there's no selection operating, right? That is a simple thing we can do independent of whether or not a region of the genome is functional. Now, here's why this is such strong evidence. Because if, for example, humans and chimps and many creationist organizations will actually have multiple kinds, right, of primates, right? So we could just look at the primates, right? So you've got like humans and then like maybe chimps and gorillas, orangutans go together, and then like New World monkeys, Old World monkeys, right? You have a couple of different created kinds within that group. Let's say that God was trying to trick us, right? Let's say that God created them with a nested hierarchical pattern of variation. So it looks like there's a series of divergence events in their evolutionary history, right? Let's say they were created that way.
Okay.
Since creation, we know that a whole bunch of variation has had to accumulate, right? One thing that creationists say is mutation rates are a lot faster than evolutionists will say. Well,
they have to be.
Those mutations, if they were probabilistic, I like the word probabilistic better than random, because random people interpret that as all equally likely, which is not the case. There's variations in likelihood, but probabilistic as opposed to deterministic, then those subsequent mutations that would occur since creation would break that nested hierarchical relationship that they were created with. You would end up having mutations that make it look like different relationships. So that would intermix the different groups so they wouldn't fall out in these neat lineages. The reason for that is that what you're doing is you're taking millions of years of variation that's accumulated, some of which has accumulated before these lineages split and some of which accumulated after. You're compressing all of that variation into the 4,000 years since the flood, when they're all separate from each other because they were created separate from each other, which means the only way for the pattern to emerge the way it did in this nested hierarchical pattern is for God to be dictating which specific mutations occur in order to preserve the appearance of that nested hierarchical pattern. But we know that creationists say that's not the case, right? They're not letting God intervene in what specific mutations are happening. So the existence of that pattern, specifically in the regions that are unconstrained, is not just an extremely strong piece of evidence for evolution. It is also an extremely strong piece of evidence against separate creation, because it violates explicitly the pattern we would expect to see if these different groups were separately created.
Yeah,
so that's my
fascinating.
favorite thing. That is the thing. Dead to rights. The debate is over.
And it's interesting with the nested hierarchy, because they will absolutely sort of, they used to jump up and down saying no, a nested hierarchy doesn't exist, and then they came out with the orchard thing where it's sort of these nested hierarchy exist, but only to this point where they were created.
Only to this point, exactly.
Right. And then they sort of said, but that's a relatively new thing. They used to say no, there's no nested hierarchy, and they've just been forced to accept it over the years.
Right, that's really like a last few decades thing, just because of like sequencing technology. Like, you cannot escape the nested, like, it's there, right? You can't claim it's not there. It's clearly there. And the excuse they have to make to connect the trees in the orchard is, well, this tree and this tree are more similar to each other, so God made them look more similar, so you build a nested hierarchy. But if it's not functionally significant, then there's no reason for the sequences to be that way, and the pattern of mutations would perturb the created nested hierarchy that was preloaded. And so the existence of that nested hierarchy in the non-constrained sequences is like, that is the thing. That is it. It is unambiguous. And as you know, many creationists like to say, oh, well, that's ambiguous. That works for your theory. It works for our theory. This nested hierarchy across kinds and unconstrained sequences is incompatible with special creation. Just straight up, it violates the predictions of special creation, unless
the God is deceptive enough
and intervening to make it look that way. Yep.
And I suppose that holds for a lot of things, like what we see in geology, unless the God is, stacking up the layers to make it look like they've got all of this. But sort of then I've noticed you get into sort of last Thursdayism, that, well, God created it like that. And at that point, like you said earlier, Dan, you've got nowhere to test that. You're at a sort of dead end. I would say that my favorite's probably endogenous retroviruses. It's interesting because the endogenous retroviruses, they have their nested hierarchy as well. They're evolving as well, and we sort of have this nested hierarchy for them as well. So it's really fascinating that all life will fall into this hierarchy that comes out. Even the viruses writing their DNA into our DNA. It's really fascinating.
And those are a subset of the sequences I'm talking about, right? When we talk about these nested, like when you look at endogenous retroviruses of primates, for example, right? They make their own nested hierarchy. The endogenous retroviruses of rodents make a separate single clade. And there's no reason for that to be the case if they were created separately and then have mutated since then. You would expect those sequences to start to intermingle with each other if they are just mutating probabilistically since their creation 6,000 years ago. There's no reason to think the endogenous retroviruses of primates are going to make one clade and the rodents are going to make another clade. But that's what we see. It matches the host organisms exactly.
Well, especially as sort of Donnie claims that it was God doing it to help us out. There's absolutely zero reason to have any hierarchy at all.
They're just doing their job,
Right.
And the key thing here again is the unconstrained. We know that endogenous retroviruses are not under what's called purifying selection. That's selection against mutations when they happen. All right, that's called purifying selection. Selection keeps the sequence the same. When a DNA sequence is really critical for you to stay alive, it stays the same across long periods of time, right? And endogenous retroviruses are not doing that. You can argue that they're functional, that they're important, that they're critical, we need them, fine. I don't care. If Donnie or anybody else wants to say they're 100% of herbs are functional, be my guest. Doesn't change the argument at all, because it is an empirical fact that we can directly observe that they don't experience purifying selection. So clearly, they're not. It doesn't work with the they were created separately and then they've changed since then. No, they haven't, because if they did, they would be intermingling and we wouldn't get any clades for the different groups, but we do.
And that's empirical observation objective data.
Uh,
Absolutely.
Yeah, because then you get into like the historical versus observational science nonsense, which is a false dichotomy because the techniques, the way of making predictions and testing predictions is the same, but
Mhm.
you start to get into that kind of nonsense. But then you look at something like endogenous retroviruses, and that's direct observational. That's not historical. We're not interpreting fossils, right? We're directly sequencing them and seeing what the pattern is.
Does that annoy you that sort of, people use this observational versus historical sort of science kind of thing? I
Yeah.
think I've heard a
Yeah.
lot of creationists use it, some of which they have done philosophy of science, so they should know better than to sort of say that.
Yeah, I can't stand it because I have a PhD in this field. You know what? You know where I learned that distinction, where I learned those terms? I
From
learned it from
creationists.
creationists. It
Yeah, of
never
course.
came up as an
Yeah.
undergrad, as a graduate student. And I want to be clear, when you're doing a PhD, it is a very narrow thing you're focused on. So
Mm.
people might say, yeah, but you weren't doing like philosophy of science. Is it fair point? I wasn't doing philosophy of
Yeah.
science in graduate school, but I almost got a philosophy minor as an undergraduate. I took a bunch of
Mhm.
philosophy classes
Oh,
and
that's cool.
never came up. Never came up,
Yeah.
not once. So
Yeah.
it just I can't.
What's your opinion of philosophy? A lot of scientists hate philosophy, and with good reason. I feel like sometimes it is
Yeah.
used as a truncheon against somebody that doesn't have enough experience with
Yeah.
it. So I completely get it.
Yeah. That's
I
how you go ahead. Sorry.
well, I remember Erica just saying to Sam, redefine living, like, don't hit me with that precept. And they just didn't want anything to do with it. And that's sort of what some people think of philosophy, just, philosophy bros trying to trick you kind of thing.
That
How
yeah.
do you feel?
That's basically my opinion. Yeah. And
Right.
I've had that same experience with Sam. I remember I was on something with Sam with Sam was in the room and I was talking with
Yeah.
Donnie
Yeah.
and Raw Matt about something. And then he goes
Mm.
in that smug way, Dr. Dan, do you consider yourself an empirical atheist? And I was like, Sam, let me tell you how much I don't care. I just
Right.
don't care. Like, what do you want me to say? Because I will say those words and I will never think of them again in my life. Do you want me to say yes or no? Because I'll say whatever you want me to say, and then I'll leave and you can make fun of me for half an hour. I don't care. Like, I
Well,
just don't care.
I mean, when the rubber hits the road, everyone's an empiricist, So if something's important, you're using your senses to confirm it.
Right.
Like, for instance, nobody's going to cross the road and go, okay, well, I'll use idealism.
Yeah,
I'll
right. Like, no, I'm
envisage
gonna
a
let's look both
yeah,
ways first. Yeah. I
exactly. Like,
just
so yeah, I
in it like in these conversations, like when I'm talking to creationists, whether it's YouTube randos or like a professional, like Michael Behe or something, I'm
mm,
always, always, always trying to keep it narrow, like
yeah,
stuff we have observed. Like, let's just talk about things we can directly measure because then you
mhm,
can't get into all that other nonsense about like, well, how do you actually know? Like, I just
yeah,
don't care. Like, I've done like when we talk about like genetic entropy as an example, which is the idea
yeah, yeah,
of mutations building up in a population to the point where that population is going to go extinct because the mutations ultimately break things. They have a negative fitness cost, right? So ultimately, the rate of reproduction falls below the level of replacement, and the population goes extinct. Now, that is a concept that like evolutionary biology has grappled with for decades and decades and decades. That is a thing
mhm,
that we have dealt with. That is like fundamentally what I was doing in graduate school in my research.
right,
And
right,
so you get into these conversations about genetic entropy, which is a made up creationist word for this thing in real life called error catastrophe, is the real word
mhm,
for what creationists call genetic entropy. Those are the same thing. And so you get into like a debate with like Paul Price about this, and he just wants to talk about defining fitness and stuff. No, 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 no. There was a stream
yeah,
he did on Standing for Truth, probably a couple of years ago at this point, and it was like just hours of arguing about the definition of fitness and da, da, da. And I got in there and I said, here's the paper that proves you wrong. Let's just talk
mhm,
about this paper. And we spent 20 minutes just talking about this one paper. Like, here's an experiment. Here's what they found. It proves that you are wrong. I don't
Right.
care how you define fitness. This paper, the population does the opposite of what you say it should do.
Mhm.
You're wrong. Like, let's keep it
Yep.
focused on that. And because you're absolutely right, where if you get into like the philosophy of science and all this stuff, it does just become a truncheon to beat biologists over the head who are not trained in that. And you're going to
Yeah.
sound dumb if you try to talk about something you're not trained in. So like if anybody wants to talk to me about that, I'm out. I don't care. Like
Okay.
what's your philosophy? What's your philosophy of knowledge, or what's your theory of truth or whatever? Like, I don't care. I can
Mm.
measure it. And we can make predictions, and then the measurements we take match the predictions, and that's how I know it works. And like that's it, guy. Like, I don't care. I don't. And this is funny because I just said I took a bunch of philosophy classes and was like, I think I was one class away from getting a philosophy minor if I had like pick the right classes or something. And like,
Yeah.
it was interesting as an intellectual exercise. And a couple of those classes, like one of them was biomedical ethics, which was like
Mm.
really interesting in terms of
Yeah.
like the practice of medicine and the practice of science. Really
Right.
interesting.
Yeah.
But other of those classes just very abstract and like you're just going around in circles and like I don't care. It doesn't actually affect how I
Mm.
do science.
Right, right. I mean, I like engaging in those conversations, but I'm not a biologist. I'm not, I don't have a degree in anything, so um, I'm really just discussing random things and just whatever I enjoy, I enjoy. So I've got no sort of thing. But I think in a way, you need to start at some kind of set of axioms, and for the most part, I've found that creationists do until they get into trouble and then they want to question, like you say, how do you know what you know? And then they go to solipsism, for instance. How can you know anything, kind of thing. It's very, very difficult to deal with. And I think a lot of scientists, um, they do go to the YouTube sphere and they just hit these creationist apologists who will exploit that lack of knowledge to make them seem stupid and they don't know what they're talking about, kind of thing. Um, do you think that there should be some kind of training in how to deal with apologists as a scientist?
I think I think more broadly than that, I think there needs to be, as
Okay.
part of every science education, there needs to be formal training in science communication, I think is what
There
needs to
isn't
happen.
in your.
No.
There's a unit for science communication in. I mean, I studied networking, and there was a unit for science. Like it's compulsory for every single person in the STEM fields in the uni that I
Well
went to.
well, I'm jealous. That is a thing that everybody should
Okay.
have to do. And when I
Yeah.
talk about science communication, I don't mean like scientific writing or like conference presentations. I mean scientific communication with a non-science audience. That
Yes,
should
that's
be
exactly what it was. Yeah.
that's what everybody should have to do. Whether
Mm.
you're in biology, physics, think about how much further along we would be if climate scientists as a whole had training in
Right.
science communication, right? Think about where
Mm.
we would be if every evolutionary biologist had training in how to communicate the basics of
Mm.
evolutionary theory to non-biologists. Like
Right.
a lot of the stuff that like we're dealing with here wouldn't be a
Mm.
thing because at just like a more baseline level, people would be exposed to correct information that they could understand, and not just understand the facts that they are told, but the underlying
Yeah.
why this is valid. And
Mm.
like in I wish that was a thing that everybody everywhere had to do, but like in the US, that's just like not a thing. That is just like you're doing your
That
research, you're
blows me
publishing your
away.
papers, not a thing. And I think that's really where it has to start. I don't think you could. I would love for the narrower form of that, of like, here's the field you're studying, here's the nonsense you're going to have to deal with, here's how to deal with it. Right. I
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
love for that to be a thing. That would not fly at all. I could see a
Okay.
million ways in the United States specifically that would not fly. Right. You'd have Republican governors trying to like defund their state college programs, their state college systems, because, oh, the
Okay.
professors, those woke professors teaching their students that creationism isn't really science, right? Or learn, their grad students learning how to indoctrinate the population, right? All that kind of stuff. It was
Ugh.
just logistically impossible politically in the United States, which itself is a
Well,
big red flag, right?
do you think that is it because of those reasons, because of creationist government not wanting science people to communicate to people on the street like myself, kind of thing? They don't want you to get across meaningful science to people, or do you think partly it's I might suspect that maybe partly because a lot of people in science don't feel it's their job to communicate with ordinary people. They see it
It's
as
yeah, it's both. It that
mm,
runs both ways, right? So you have a situation where the scientists kind of are happy to be in their bubble communicating with each other and not really worrying about accurately disseminating their information, their field, their research, whatever, to a non-scientific audience. And that's a huge problem. Scientists
mm,
need to be thinking about how to communicate their work to the non-scientist public,
yes,
like, just in general, science, that is a thing that should be front and center of the, if you list three things scientists do, right? Like research, science, right? In those top
mm,
three, communicating to the general public should be one of them, and it's not.
right,
And
right,
that's a huge problem. The other side
yeah,
of it, though, the political side of it, is if you had scientists doing that as a matter of course, you would definitely run into a political problem where in the United States, our right wing Republican Party would come down hard on that, and they would say, oh, indoctrination, political bias, blah, 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 blah. But what it really is that a scientifically illiterate population, and a population not just scientifically illiterate in this or that specific field, but that is illiterate in terms of critical thinking and being able to critically evaluate information, is more
mhm,
susceptible to the kind of nonsense that comes out of a right
right,
wing government and right wing politicians. And you're more likely to buy into that nonsense if you have not been trained in both the content of science, the what, but also the critical thinking, the
the methodology,
evaluation, the how
mm,
of science.
yeah,
And so it's on scientists, practicing scientists, to make it as part of what they do on a regular basis, communicating with the public, both the what and the how. Here's what we know, and here's how we can be confident in it, right?
mm,
But doing so is going to invite a political fight that scientists also need to be open to having. And I think a lot of scientists are just kind of, I think there's the I don't want to do the communication thing for its own sake. That's not part of my job. I don't want to do it. And then there's
yeah.
the I would do it if not for the political fight. I don't want to have the political fight group. That is a smaller group, but I think that group also exists.
That's so unfortunate, because if we compare that to the right wing creationists in these things, they're very good at doing exactly that, is
Yup.
communicating to their audience about their beliefs and
Yes.
misrepresenting the science. And they don't, and this is going back to where I sort of said, well, why don't sort of they get attacked? They're not worried about being attacked for their creationist belief. They sort of have that shield of religion to hide behind, perhaps, because they can just sort of say, "Well, that's my religion, freedom of
They
religion."
can Right, they can do both sides of it,
Right?
right? When they're on offense, they could be like, "Science, science, science, you need to pay
Yeah.
attention to us," but then you turn around and attack them and go, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, religious freedom, I should be able to say this, give
Right.
me a break." Well, you can't have it both ways, guys. Are you doing science or are you doing religion?
Mm,
Which is, are you preaching or are you teaching science? Because if you're teaching science, now you're opening
yeah.
yourself up to criticism. If you're
Yes.
preaching, okay, but then keep it over there, not in the public schools,
Right.
right? Pick one. And they're very successfully in the United States having it both ways. And part of the
Mm,
reason for that goes full circle what we were talking about before, because for a long time the attitude was don't give them oxygen, don't give them a platform, and the effect of that has
yes.
been to seed the field, right? Scientists have not
Mhm,
wanted to participate in that discussion? Well, it's happening anyway. And now for the better part of 4 decades, the creationists have kind of had that communication space to themselves. And it's only relatively recently that I really do think there's a lot of generational thing. Like you talk about Dr. Bundy, right? Like me and him are kind of the
Yeah.
same generation coming up here. Like
Yeah.
our generation is a lot more aware of this stuff, whether it's the evolution stuff, the anti-vax stuff, the climate change stuff. Like we're like, there are way more people my age in the field that are willing to have that fight than
Yeah.
the generation that trained me and the people my age. And that's not to say that generation is bad or wrong or whatever. It's just a different attitude of approaching these anti-science entities and these anti-science forces, right? There was the don't give them a platform, starve them of oxygen approach. I don't think that worked. The next generation coming up is much more willing, I think, to fight back, which is what needs to happen.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And they also grew up in a time where there wasn't the level of connectivity that we have today. And you know, now it's you know, you can get information at the drop of a hat. You know, you don't have to go to scientists. You can, you know, someone will have information up, whether it's correct or not. Now there's the problem.
Yeah. And you don't have to have kind of a more formal platform either, right? You don't need to have a blog on science blogs or be an author for the Panda's Thumb. You can have a YouTube channel and just get this stuff out there, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to potentially reach more eyeballs than kind of the older ways of communicating this stuff, right? You look at like the early 2000s, the blog fights between Panda's Thumb and like Uncommon Descent. Like that was like a couple hundred people yelling at each other, right? That was a very small number of people. Meanwhile, Discovery Institute was at the time and is still currently in this decades-long PR fight that the scientific community as a broad entity was just not engaging in. Well, okay, we're having this, what appears to be a science fight, right, on the internet. One side is engaging in a PR fight and the other side just isn't.
Yeah.
And here we are, 20 years on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and the sizes of these channels are incredible. You know, like the worst apologetics channels are, you know, 35K subscribers and things. It's absolutely
horrific. And they just and you get this feedback loop where it gets worse and worse, where it starts off with evolution stuff, and then you get into theology stuff, and then you get into flat earth stuff, and it just like you can see this trajectory where as it becomes, the audience becomes bigger and bigger, you have to like become more and more extreme in your anti-science in order to retain that audience and continue to grow it. And that's a really destructive force. And like, you know, there's a role that like the capital T, capital A, the algorithm plays in that, whether you're talking about YouTube or Twitter or TikTok or wherever. It's this push towards more extreme views that draws more eyeballs. And
it does, yeah.
So you see like a couple years ago, this was so starkly illustrated when the COVID vaccines came out, and AIG was like kind of just didn't want to talk about it. Discovery Institute was like soft anti-vax, like pretty much like there were some basic COVID truthers, like Douglas Axe was like basically a COVID truther, like very overtly for a few years over there. But then CMI was really interesting, and they were like vocally pro-vaccine. Like vocally, like putting out videos on their YouTube channels, like this is really important. This is, you know, this is a great scientific advance. We should all do this. Keep each other safe. Keep yourself safe. And the comment threads on those YouTube videos, they did 2 of them, and the comment threads were incredibly hostile to the pro-vaccine message that CMI was trying to put out there. And there were a couple of people in particular. I think Jonathan Sarfati was one of the guys who was really trying to like fight back against it. And just astonished of like, there was one comment where he was like, I can't believe you're taking such an anti-science position. And it's like, sir, do you hear yourself? You are one of the most prominent members of a young earth creationist organization. You have trained your audience to do this.
And people that will believe a conspiracy in science, that they're, you know, making up these results. And I think I heard one geologist say that they sent in who was it? It was David McQueen said that they sent in these results to labs to get the result that they want, and they made it all up. So when you have a mind that says, hey, they can do a conspiracy, it's very easy for someone to come along and go, well, you know what else is a conspiracy? Yeah. And that's, I don't, you're right. I don't know why they're surprised.
It's the same, and especially because the people they're saying for decades, right? These organizations are they're not just saying evolutionary biologists are wrong. They're saying that evolutionary biologists are lying to you, right?
Yes.
Young Earth creationism is at its heart a conspiracy theory wherein all of the field of biology is conspiring, right, to like keep the truth down. And at the heart of it, we biologists all know that we're wrong, but we're all in the club and we're conspiring, right? That's at its heart. Young Earth creationism is a conspiracy theory about the scientific establishment. You can't train your audience that that's the case and then expect them to say, but in this case, those same scientists, you got to listen to them now. This is important and good, and you should listen to them. No, you're not going to trust them when this new vaccine comes out either.
No, of course
right?
Not.
Like, of course, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's
really...
again, the scientific community, for decades have been dropping the ball on that because we have not been doing the counter programming on all of that, right? We're just content to like do our research and publish our papers, and like this naive belief that like facts will change people's minds. One of the things that I've had to internalize since 2016, right? The rise of Trump, right? The Trump era. We've all heard the phrase from, I forget which right-wing dude came up with it, that facts don't care about your feelings, right? We've all heard that before. Right, Shapiro, yeah.
It was Shapiro, yeah.
The truth is actually the other way around. Your feelings don't care about the facts. You're going to believe what you want to believe, and facts are not going to convince you otherwise. And like the whole scientific community operates in this fantasy land where that is not true, where you can actually convince somebody that climate change is real, that the vaccine is safe and effective, that Homo sapiens is 300,000 years old, if I just find the right information, if I just give you the right fact, you'll agree with me. And that's just not true. That's not how human minds work. And we just have to acknowledge that and be willing to like play in reality where like I said before, like whether you want to participate in the politics or not, it's there and you have to engage with it.
Yeah, I think that you can appeal to people's feelings of things, but I think that there's, I think I would never underestimate the power of cognitive dissonance. It's so powerful in changing somebody's mind, because if you come at things in that logical way, they can't, if you can show that say biology and medicine is dependent on evolution, then they will still continue to use medicine because they absolutely rely on medicine.
But will they though?
Well, most of them will, yeah.
I mean, think about just look at the excess deaths though in the United States. So in the United States, we have very robust demographic data by political affiliation on a county by county basis. And you can look at excess deaths from COVID, and there is a huge disparity between the predominantly Republican, like if you look at forget the ones that are in the middle, but if you look at the counties that are like more than 60% Republican versus more than 60% Democratic, there's a huge disparity in excess COVID deaths, where the Republican counties just have more excess deaths because they rejected vaccines, they rejected masking, they rejected doing things, remotely, right? And like you would think on something as fundamental as like you're materially increasing your risk of death in the next month, like you would think that would convince people, like numbers. Here we go. Like I could just show you the numbers. And if it comes down to this, I'm going to acknowledge that these data are true and then have to change something about my identity to incorporate that knowledge, or keep both of those things, maintain this part of my identity and also acknowledge the facts and live with that cognitive dissonance, or I could reject those facts and write it off as a conspiracy theory. What we're seeing is people are choosing door number 3.
Well, a lot of them, yes. But, what do you define as success when it comes to changing minds? If you reach 5% of them, is that successful?
Right. You
if
could
you
argue
reach
yes.
1%, is that suggest right?
Yeah,
I
you
think that,
yeah.
if you as a person, one of the, nearly 8 billion people on this planet, if you change one mind and everybody does that, once per two people, then
That's a big deal.
it's a big deal, right? So it depends on what you define as success. And you're right. You're right. So many people will sort of ignore that and dispute the facts and just say, hey, that was made up by the government because they're in that conspiracy mode. But a few people are caught by cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Well, I believe statistics, and that statistic is correct. Nobody's arguing that the statistic isn't correct, and evolution plays a part in that. I have to believe that's true because I've met people that have had their minds changed by a debate or a discussion or something that's come along.
I have too, but it's such a small number, and that's the thing. And I feel like the problem is that, again, it's a science communication thing where
Yeah.
the side of reality has just been like not playing the game for decades. And like I feel like we're kind of starting to play the
Mhm.
game now, but we just haven't been doing it at the level of like, communication that needs to be happening. And I feel like, had we looked at the anti like the global warming is fake stuff in the 90s, the intelligent design
Yeah.
stuff in the early aughts, if the scientific community had taken those two kind of phenomena and been like, okay, we need to course correct here, then you wouldn't
Yeah.
have this disparity that we see as a result of the pandemic. But because we basically seeded the ground in the information space here, you end up with a giant chunk of the population that picks that third option I just described, right? That it's a
Right.
conspiracy theory. I don't have to change my beliefs in response to facts. And
Mm.
like that, the fact that that's the case, the fact that so many people will do that is not a law of physics. It is a result of decisions people have made, both pro-science and anti-science, in terms of how we communicate. And we can
Mm.
undo that by changing the way we communicate, right? Just
Right.
imagine if the pro-science side had been trying as hard as the anti-science side for the last 40
Exactly.
years,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like just
Yeah.
imagine if a fraction of the millions of dollars the anti-science groups get, whether it's climate change, revolution, or whatever, if the pro-science side had been putting half that money, a tenth of that money towards outreach in the same way, we'd be having a completely different discussion right now. So we can change
Yeah.
it. That is an
Yeah.
optimistic thought because it means that what we're experiencing right now with the rise of all sorts of anti-science beliefs, whether it's climate change stuff, anti-vax, race realism, which is just good old-fashioned racism made to
Yeah.
sound
Pretty much. Yeah.
fancy, right?
Yeah.
It's all of that stuff is contingent upon how people communicate and what they communicate. And that
Mm.
means that the scientific community and members, people who are not in the scientific community, but are scientific communicators like you and like countless other people who just like engage in this stuff and have this conversation, the fact that we're doing it in a more robust way now, in a more conscientious way now, means that all this stuff that we're seeing rising, we can make it fall. Like, that's optimistic. I don't want to sound
Yeah.
pessimistic here because it means we have agency to like fix these problems. We just have to
Sure.
decide to do it and figure out the best way to do it.
Well, I do see the change. I mean, you see channels like Veritasm or Vsauce and all of these sort of more science-orientated channels, and I mean, they do provide entertainment through sort of that kind of physics, interesting physics things and
Mhm.
interesting factoids about our reality. But I do see that that they have so many followers. They lend weight when they say, "Hey, this is scientifically proven," and that's what we're all about. So I do see that change. So I do have a lot of optimism. But the fact that you don't get science communication in schools, that probably needs to change.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. It
now,
needs to be a
like seriously.
systematic thing. Just and not even
Yeah.
necessarily like if you're talking just general college curriculum,
Mm.
you could keep the communication stuff until graduate school because those are going to be the specialists, right? So like you could do that later, but there needs to be like just um information literacy and critical thinking. Just like needs to be part of the equation for a high school education, a college education, whatever. Um
Mm.
just not just how do we know what's true? Not just what is true, but how do we know and how
How do
can
you
we
know it? Yeah.
evaluate it, right?
Yeah.
That is not taught outside of like maybe in like ninth grade biology class, you learn about the scientific method once,
Mm.
right? But then in a
Yeah.
week, you're done with
Yep.
that and you never revisit it again.
Yep.
That's not doing the job. That's not doing the
Yep.
job. You need to
Mhm.
be like, you need to come out of school with that kind of body of knowledge as like one
Mm.
of the primary things you learned.
Yeah.
It's
I might,
now we got to fix.
you know, there's so much I didn't go to, and you know, I've just looked at the time, and it's like an hour and 45.
I
So
know we've been
what
talking.
I'll
We could
do,
just keep going for another hour. I'm
no,
sure.
there's so much I wanted to get to. Absolutely. I didn't even really discuss debate tactics, which I want to. I didn't really discuss that, and you know, but that's
I don't. Well,
okay.
look, I don't want to invite myself on, but I'd be happy to just keep talking some other time. We'll
Oh,
just keep
sure.
talking.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
More than happy to. But so what I wanted to really get at was what is the goal of your channel? Where do you, I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds like me, you sort of were peer pressured into starting a channel kind of thing. You know, like that was
A little bit.
essentially
Yeah.
what happened. Somebody twisted your arm and said, you have to start a channel, and you went, okay.
Oh,
So
I have
but
to.
now that you've sort of got this channel, where are you headed from here? Do you see a aim or a goal for your channel,
Yeah.
something that you're working towards?
Yeah, so there's kind of two things. First is I want to be a reference source where, you know, like the old Talk Origins website that you could go to that's like it's like old
Yes.
now.
Yep.
It's it's like peak 90s internet, but you can still go there and a lot of that information is still really good and it's got this
Yeah. Still relevant.
index of
Mm,
creationist claims. Super awesome. I that's I don't want to like put myself on that level, but like I want my channel to be a place where people can go, hey, I heard this creationist make this genetics based or this evolution
mhm.
argument. Go to my channel. You're going to have a quick, 5 to 30-minute accessible for a non-scientist explanation of why that thing is wrong. It's going to give you the ammunition to push back on that thing. That's the first thing. It's for people who are hearing creationist arguments just quick, accessible. Why is that thing wrong? Right? That's kind of the small scale focus.
Mhm.
The larger focus is like I mentioned earlier, is that once you kind of train your brain to believe one kind of anti-science, it's really easy to just buy into all the anti-science because it's not about the specific content of this field or that field. It's about a way of thinking and a way of critically evaluating information. And I want what I'm doing with the evolution stuff to basically just shut off that avenue as a way in. I don't want creationism to be a way into all these other kinds of anti-science beliefs and anti-science practices, whether that's
Okay.
anti-vax stuff or climate change denialism or racism stuff,
Mm.
the anti-trans stuff, like all of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
stuff. It's the same way of thinking, this very anti-science way that is just a
Mhm.
failure of critical thinking and a failure to evaluate information. And once you put one foot into that, you end up jumping into all the other ones. And so I
Yeah.
don't want creationism to be the gateway drug there. I want to cut off that
Mhm.
avenue into that way of thinking that leads to all of these anti-science beliefs. Now it's totally possible to, come in through any of the other ways too, right? There's
Yeah.
multiple
Yeah.
entry points there, but my field as an evolutionary biologist, I'm not qualified to deal with the flat earth stuff and the this stuff and
Yeah.
the you've got
Yeah.
the perpetual motion machine quackery and like all this stuff, but I can cut off the creationism avenue into that.
Yeah.
So that's what I want to do. I want to, so the two things are provide just resources for people who are doing this to
Mhm.
push back, and then also for people who are on the fence at risk of tumbling down that rabbit hole, want to shut off that avenue into it.
It's almost like you want to vaccinate them against bad creationist
That is
arguments.
exactly how I think of it. I want to be a
Yeah, that's
vaccine
amazing.
against misinformation more broadly. Yeah, that's the
That's
idea.
amazing. Oh, that's
That's the
fantastic.
goal.
And I have to say, Dan, I've linked his channel in the chat. Please do go and subscribe. It is a great channel. I do look up videos from there all the time. I had some amazing information on endogenous retroviruses that I've used for a debate. I've emailed Dan before and he's helped me out. Absolutely fantastic guy. Absolutely
Thank
fantastic
you.
content. So please do go over there and check it out. I'm not an evolutionary guy. I'm not really an anything really. But I like to defer to the people that spend their life, and it really annoys me when people spend their lives studying and working in one field and they get a specialization in that field, and then somebody comes in that has absolutely no knowledge and wants to tell them what it's like.
Yeah, love that. Love that.
Yeah, I once saw somebody try to sort of creation-explain a paper that Jay helped write.
It was in the lab. It was,
Bundy.
oh my God, that moment, that was my introduction to Jay Bundy. For people who don't know, Pocket Locker 86 is his channel. That I know the exact moment you're talking about, and it was amazing. It was an incredible moment. It was about it's the Lenski lab. It's this famous long-term experiment in bacterial evolution. And he had to say, I was in that lab. You're explaining my own work to me.
Yes. Yeah, incredible.
Just amazing.
So and I absolutely rely on content like Dr. Dan's to survive in the debating ring. So I appreciate everything you do and all of the help you've given me, whether you know it or not. I know I emailed you a couple of times, but I've
warms my heart because that's what I want. That's exactly what I just described, right? I put it out there, other people can use it and just keep it going.
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating. I was, sort of, as I mentioned, I'm autistic on the spectrum, and I was obsessed with endogenous retroviruses for like a few months on end. And your channel was one of the best places that I ever went. So absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
Are you doing any other debates, and what's upcoming for you?
So I have, so I don't have any debate schedule. It's kind of funny actually. So most young Earth, most professional creationists at this point won't talk to me. Over the years, I've talked to, a bunch of people, credentialed and not credentialed. I've had a bunch of guests on, most recently, I had that debate earlier this year with Dr. Casey Luskin from Discovery Institute. Let me tell you how many dozens of other creationists I have emailed of like, hey, I would love to talk to you about this specific thing. And they're just like varying degrees of nope, not talking to you.
Well, I don't get invites back to Standing for Truth anymore. I think
that's because
and truly.
Yeah, that's because Standing for Truth has to rotate through an ever-evolving cast of newbies, essentially. And once you become too informed, he doesn't want you there anymore because that ruins the vibes. But yeah, so I have, so I'm in the middle of my semester right now, which is chaos. So what I'm doing now is some shorter things and live shows, basically. I haven't had time to put together like good, robust, pre-recorded kind of longer form things. I think so it's Monday. I haven't yet put up a link for what I'm going to do this week, but it may actually be something kind of related to my real life job because talking about science communication, my class sizes are 450, 460 people, 480 people. And so that's very much a challenge in science communication. So what I might do is actually, I have on my never-ending list of things to do is revise some of the graphics that I use in class. And I might just pop on and do that live on air, talking about the science that it's showing, but also the graphic design and why I'm showing certain things the way I am to emphasize certain points and be able to direct people's attention where I want it to be. So I may do that this week if I don't have time to do anything else. And then the following week, I've got a really fun show planned because that'll be the kind of second week of October there. That's my birthday week. So I'm going to do a birthday show with a bunch of our mutual acquaintances. And we're going to talk about various sciencey and also politics things. There'll be some election stuff because I'm a giant politics nerd. And so that'll be really fun. That's going to be on Wednesday. So Wednesday, the 2nd, is I think I might do kind of like graphic design in my class things and talk about a little bit of evolution in that regard. And then the following week, which will be October 9th, will be the birthday thing, which I'm really looking forward to. And then I
Oh,
plan between then and the election, because as the whole world is forced to know, we have a presidential election coming
uh-huh.
up on November
Oh,
5th.
I had no
Register,
idea. I had no
no, just
idea. It was,
zoom.
yeah,
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 register to vote in the US if you're not registered to vote. Harris Walls
absolutely.
2024. It's, I know it's, overstated, and every election is the most important election, but like really, if like, especially for climate change, like if Trump gets elected again, like forget about it.
It's
We're way past
terrible.
the
Yeah.
tipping point at that. We're done. So like you got to vote. You got to vote Harris Walls. So I'm definitely going to do some election related stuff between now and the election. I just don't know exactly what form that is going to take, but that will definitely be part of my content until November, because that
Well,
matters.
I had a thought that's like, do they make you aware of, like, because I don't have to worry about it. Everybody in Australia has to vote. It's compulsory and
I
it's the
know.
best thing
So
ever.
cool.
Well, to be honest with you, I think that sort of, if you're a citizen of a country, voting should be an obligation to the country. But, that's another discussion for another time.
Yeah.
But I think that do they give you enough information about where to register and how to actually do this? Would that
Oh,
be
tons.
something that?
Tons of
Okay,
information.
okay.
And I might, and I probably, what I'll probably do if I do anything is it'll involve voter registration information and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Mhm.
Especially for the states that are going to end up deciding the
Yeah,
election, because our stupid ass election system is like it's on a state by state basis. So there's only 7 states that actually matter.
yeah,
It's dumb.
yeah. Fair
It's
enough.
dumb.
I do have
Yeah.
a couple of questions. If there's only 2 or 3, I
Let's do
think.
it.
There's
Yeah.
not a ton of them.
Let's
Yeah.
do it.
So first off is Bitter Truth, who sent in a super chat for 4.99. Dr. Dan, why mammals' majority genes carries transposonal elements?
Yeah. So like our genome is if you break it down by little bits, it's like 40 something percent retrotransposons, 8% endogenous
Hmm.
retroviruses. And the reason for this, there's a really good paper on this exact thing, uh, is that it's called the bioenergetic cost of a gene. And what this paper found was that, so basically the way these things get there is you have like genomic parasites, like little bits of DNA that all they do is just copy themselves. They do this copy and paste thing. So they make, you have DNA that they inject themselves into your genome, and then they make a
Hmm.
bit of RNA, and then that RNA gets copied back to DNA, and then they put that piece of DNA in your genome. So they do this copy and paste thing throughout your
Okay.
genome.
Yeah.
So you end up growing the amount of these transposable elements in your genome over, evolutionary time. And the reason we can't get rid of them is that the cost to copying the DNA is so low in terms of the energy that's required to do it relative to like the amount of energy that we use just to stay alive, is that that extra little cost is it's below the threshold for genetic drift. It means it's such a small difference that it's invisible to natural selection. So there's no selection against having these elements in your genome. Now, some of them are active. They're still, many of them are mutated and broken and they don't do anything. Some of them are still active. They still make RNA some of the time. Turns out
Okay.
that amount of energy is also below the threshold, but
Okay.
making proteins is not. So we're really good at inactivating, like if a virus invades your DNA, we're really good at inactivating that virus for a number of reasons. But then once it's there, we can't get rid of it. And that's why we have
Mm.
genomes that are just full of these transposable elements, is that the cost of keeping them is so low that
Right.
we can't select for not having them.
So would getting rid of them basically take more energy than actually just keeping on
It's
replicating them?
I don't know if getting rid of them would, because that's like a one-shot thing, but
Yeah,
regulating
gotcha.
them to the point where they don't use any energy, would that level
Right,
of strict
right.
regulation would cost
Mm.
more energy than just kind of letting them, it's called leaky
Do whatever.
transcription, where they're just
Do
like
they
active at a very low level. Yeah.
do they contribute to the mutational rate that sort of, these benefits and detriments come up? Would they contribute to
Um,
that, or are they just the same rate as any
they're
other
not
part of
going
the
to change
genome?
the rate, because the rate
Yes.
is based mostly on the fidelity of copying your DNA. And
Mhm.
that's not entirely independent of the sequence, but it's mostly independent of the sequence. There are certain
Right.
combinations that are more likely to cause the enzyme to like miss, but that's a
Mm.
relatively low level of variation in the rate. Um, so yeah, they're not really contributing to the rate, but they do cause,
Okay.
the size of the genome gets bigger over time.
Yeah,
Essentially,
yeah,
is the trend.
obviously, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The next question is from Hillhugger using a 16-month chat. That's a long time. Thank you so much, Hillhugger.
That's a good question.
Why isn't biogeography used more as an argument?
It should be. Biogeography is an incredible argument for evolution. So biogeography is the geographical distribution, not just of living species, but also of extinct species, where their fossils are. And the beautiful thing about biogeography is you can use the combination of where things live right now, where things used to live, and our knowledge of geology and plate tectonics to wind back the clock to explain how things got where they are right now. And that allows you, talk about like a strong argument, is where you make accurate predictions and then you test those predictions, right? And biogeography, one of the best examples, one of the most famous predictions ever, which is this book right here, one of my favorite books, Your Inner Fish. And that's Tiktaalik on the cover right there, which is this wonderful intermediate specimen that we think represents kind of the transition from marine to terrestrial life. And that prediction and being able to find that specimen was essentially an exercise in biogeography, because we're looking at the continents where they would have been at the times when the transition from water to land would have taken place. And then we're going and looking for those formations where they exist now, which is not where they existed back then, and saying these are the species that should have lived in that place at that time. And lo and behold, we find that exact fossil specimen right where we expected it to be in the geological column. That is beautiful. Like the fact that we can pinpoint where specific fossils are to a narrow band. I mean, in geological time, we're talking a span of just a few dozens of millions of years, which in geological time is short. And
nothing,
and geographically, we're talking narrow it to a few square miles on the surface of the world. That is,
was it in Nova Scotia or something?
Yeah, it was up in Canada. It was up in northern Canada.
Yeah,
and it's just incredible that we're able to make that precise a prediction, and that is biogeography allowed us to do that. Yeah, it's wonderful.
I've used that as an argument before. I've heard multiple people use an argument that we did predict Tiktaalik to be exactly where it was, both temporally and physically, geographically.
It's extremely, and the whole field of biogeography does that. You can look at all sorts of things. The distribution of flightless birds. One of my favorite examples is the distribution of marsupials. And where I live in New Jersey, we have a native marsupial. It's one of the few species outside of Australia. And you can look at the fossil distribution around the world, Africa, North America, South America, and you can explain why a marsupial lives along the east coast of the United States through biogeography. And it's so cool.
Yeah, and the real interesting one is monotremes. You know, that they're just in some sections of Australia, just sort of narrow, very specific sections.
And also in some of the nearby islands, right? They're really isolated. It's another great example. Sorry, now I'm just nerding out about this. One of my favorite examples of this that's so cool is New Zealand. Because New Zealand never got mammals, because New Zealand is a continental landmass that was never connected to any of the other big landmasses. So New Zealand got birds, but never mammals in its ecological history. So you look at like even Australia, right, has all the marsupials rather than the eutherian mammals, but there's big carnivorous dogs, big carnivorous cats, anteaters, flying squirrels, like all the ecological niches are filled with marsupials. In New Zealand, it's all birds because mammals were never there. So you have birds radiated to fill all. It's beautiful. It's so cool. And that's biogeography, explaining how that happened. It's so cool.
Fantastic.
It's a great field.
Hillhugger. Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic question, Hillhugger. Just quickly, I've got 5 readerships by Left-Handed Jedi. Thank you so much, LHJ. But always comes through. Fantastic person. They went to, and I like to read these out. You got Regios, Professor Phil Bell. Oh, you just answered one of his comments. Hi, Prof. Sterling Nash, Calasia 789, Stoic, and Aaron Pimentel. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The next question is from Alex Markel, and Alex writes, why is he so hilariously bad at coming up with new arguments?
Because they're not doing science. Because they're not doing, like, it's that simple. They're not doing science. So they're not investigating new things. When you do science, you learn stuff and that leads to new questions, right? That's the cycle. When I show the scientific method in class, the big thing that I try to get across to my students is one, it's a nonlinear process. You're always looping back and fixing things and trying new things.
Yeah.
But two, even when everything works, when you get the answer you expect, when your prediction is accurate and you can repeatedly show that it's accurate, you're not done. It's not just like, congratulations, you did science. Here's your award. Put it on your mantle. Ta-da. Like, no, now you've learned something. Now there's something new you have to explain. And you just keep going around and finding new questions to ask. Creationists are not engaged in that. They're not doing science. So they're operating inside this closed system and they just keep bouncing off the walls instead of finding new things to ask about and new things to figure out over time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're bad at that's why all the arguments are recycled. And you could see something that looks shiny and new, and then you kind of take it apart a little bit and you're, oh, that's just a waiting time problem argument. Oh, that's just irreducible complexity again. And it's the same, like maybe dozen arguments that just get recycled in all these different combinations because they're not doing science.
Yeah. And you'll see the same in philosophy circles as well. It's the same, theological, cosmological, all the same arguments just come up again and again and again. And sort of as we learn new things, as I said, they just account for stuff. They don't actually discover anything themselves. So what, as Dan says, why would you have new questions? You don't actually discover anything. This is a fantastic question from Less Standard Jedi. Couldn't we rewrite viruses for beneficial aspects instead of negative?
We do. There's some gene therapies do that. So there's the one that I know of is a gene therapy. It's one of the only gene therapies actually like in use. It may be the only one, although I know there are a bunch in clinical trials right now that are broadly similar. But the one that I know of that actually like works, it's like miraculous, is there's a form of blindness that's genetic. And basically it's a degenerative blindness. So the people affected by it, they're born being able to see, and then they lose their vision over the course of their childhood as their retina kind of breaks down. And it's reversible. And so what they do is they basically inject into your eye a retrovirus that retroviruses, as we talked about earlier, they get into your DNA. So this retrovirus has the correct gene, the properly functioning gene that is causing this blindness. The retroviruses infect the tissue of the retina, inject their DNA, but it's not viral DNA, it's this gene that you need. And once those viruses do that at a certain enough level, the retina starts to function again and vision comes back. Amazing.
Okay, that's fascinating. And I suppose maybe just what I'd be interested in, because science can't tell me how we ought to use it. Would you see it as a potentially incredibly dangerous technology? I have some sort of
you get into the
dystopian
stuff real fast once that becomes easy to do. So you talk about like technology like CRISPR, you get into like the stratified society real fast, where there's the utopian version where we use it to increase the amount of the P53 gene. That's a tumor suppressor gene that like elephants don't get cancer because they have 20 copies of this gene in their genome. We only have 2 copies, one from mom, one from dad. And if they both mutate, that's like a necessity for almost every form of cancer. In theory, you could just use this gene editing technology to like add more P53 gene, and then you eliminate most cancers. There's the utopian version where we develop that and then we give it away for free, like we did with the COVID vaccine, right? There's also the extremely dystopian version where we figure out how to make people 10% stronger, 10% taller, whatever. And if you've got $500,000 to burn, you could have genetically modified super children, and then the poor just are whatever, right? So I know which way I think it would go. So I'm extremely nervous about the potential for that technology. We can't do it in humans yet, but we can do it in mice, and that's not that big a jump. So eventually we're going to have to grapple with that question.
So do you think sort of ethics and sort of surrounding science, sort of ethical concerns and stuff is something that ought to be talked about? Do you think that's a huge deal?
Yes, it is
Okay.
going to be huge. Once we can, especially, I mean, there's enough right now with, like one of the classes I mentioned I took as an undergraduate was biomedical ethics, talking about things like organ
Mm,
markets, for
mm.
example, right? There's so many
Oh, yeah.
questions around that. And like one of the things I learned in that class is that there's only one country in the world that allows kidney markets where you could legally sell a kidney. There's
Is it
also only
US?
there's also only one country in the world where there is no shortage of kidneys for donation, and it's the same country, and it's Iran. And
Iran.
like
Okay.
and
Interesting.
like that makes you go, "Huh." Right? Like, I don't know about that, but that opens up really complicated questions, right? Okay, well now we can edit everybody's genome, and if we know that you're gonna have kidney disease, we can fix that. Except it costs $500,000 per person to do it.
Right.
What do we do with that information, right? Do we sequence
Uh,
everyone's DNA and give everybody the correct genes for free if we know they're going to get sick? What do we do with the privacy of all that information? Are insurance companies going to use that information once
yeah.
it gets really icky really fast, right? Once you start
Oh, yeah.
opening those doors. Yeah. And it's,
Mhm.
and like the fact of the matter is the technology is going to be there in a few decades. So like we're going to have to deal with it.
Next one is 499 from Bitter Truth. Can you please explain
I can't.
endosymbiosis and how
Oh,
that
I love
happened?
this one. We just did this in class. It's so much fun. So endosymbiosis is when big cell eats small cell, gobbles it up. And then instead of getting digested, the small cell becomes part of the bigger cell. And this is how parts of our cells, eukaryotic cells, came into existence. So, like, we all have mitochondria in our cells. Everyone, don't say it in chat. Don't say it, but you all know what mitochondria. They're going to say it.
Yes.
You all know what mitochondria does. Plants and green algae, they have chloroplasts, right? That do photosynthesis. Same thing. Where way back in the day, a big cell ate some cyanobacteria, and the cyanobacteria became part of that cell, became incorporated as part of that cell. Now, the way we tend to think of this is like, oh, they form a partnership, they whatever, they work together, right? Um, no, I want you to think about this as a standoff. This is a really awkward hostage situation because what happens is the big cell eats the little cell, and then the little cell like doesn't want to get digested. So the little cell is like fighting back against getting digested inside the bigger cell. And instead of one cell winning, they reach a stalemate where now they're like, well, this is awkward. I can't spit you out, but I also can't digest you. So now you're stuck here. So, like, what are we going to do about this situation? And over time, what ends up happening is the large cell incorporates the small cell, or kind of, I guess, accommodates the small cell. The small cell, because it's living inside a cell, just needs less stuff because it could just steal
Mhm.
stuff from the big cell. So it loses a bunch of its genes and it becomes streamlined as like a photosynthesis machine. Oh, now the
Yep.
idea is going to be like, he said it's a machine. It's a metaphor, folks, not literally a machine. Okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm expecting
so
Ochangelo to jump into chat any second now you've said it,
yeah, right. Yeah, so it becomes streamlined to do this one very specific function, photosynthesis, for example, where now it's making an excess of sugar because it's not a full cell anymore. It doesn't need all that sugar it's capable of making. So it just loses some of it. The big cell benefits, it gets the sugar. The big cell, meanwhile, is making whatever it needs, and the little cell is stealing some of it because it doesn't need to waste the energy making it for itself anymore because it's surrounded by all these cellular things that it needs inside the bigger cell. So it's that's basically the process. It's a predator prey relationship that becomes a really awkward roommate slash hostage
Mm.
situation, and that's how you get endosymbiosis.
Well, wasn't there a modern example? Somebody
Yeah,
observed it in,
there's a lot.
I can't remember the paper, but that it has been observed
Yep.
today occurring, just recently. So, throw that historical science on the back burner. We do
Yeah,
actually observe it.
it's one of my favorite. It's a Polynella chromatophora is the organism that's in the process of ingesting cyanobacteria and it's becoming a new organelle. But this version of the organelle is much larger than the chloroplast we see in like trees. It's a more recent acquisition, so it's still bigger. It still has more of its genome. It's an
Mhm.
in progress endosymbiotic event, and there are even animals that are doing it. There's at least one animal. It's a sea slug called Alicia chlorotica, has it eats green algae, and its genome, the animal genome, has at least one gene for photosynthesis. So it eats the algae and steals their chloroplasts and then hangs on to them and keeps them alive to
Okay.
get some of its energy from photosynthesis. There's dozens of animals that do something like that, but very few that have actually acquired the genes to do it. But that's also endosymbiosis in process.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. That's incredible. And I couldn't remember that. Yeah, it is Paulinella that I was thinking of as I desperately Googled to try and sound knowledgeable.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Okay. Oh, that's incredible. You know, I knew it was something very, very recently. So I'm just finding the next question. Question for Dan. What are your thoughts about the insidious nature of pseudoscience and how to get through to the blind faithful? I'll find the actual question.
Man, if I had the answer to that question, though, figure it all out. But like, I don't have the answer to pseudoscience. That's what we're all trying to figure out, isn't it?
Yeah, basically. I mean, what's the insidious nature? I think that for a start, it's kind of indoctrination at the very start. Like you won't believe this stuff unless you actually grow up in it and are told it from a very early age. Usually, I don't see it catching on to somebody that's, you know, grown up, gone to college, etc., etc. I think it's just education that is the answer. You know, we have to have a solid, all-rounded education from the word go.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, as you mentioned, Dan, I think that's why the Republicans are pushing for homeschooling and these charter schools and schools where they don't have to teach a curriculum that allows people critical thinking. They can just insert whatever nonsense they want to.
That's exactly it. This is a like the thing that I do, the anti-creationism stuff is a small part of pushing back against a much broader right-wing political project, right? Just a little piece of that. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Next one from Human Girl. Thank you, Human Girl. Mark, can you please ask, how does a male and female brunette have red-headed children?
Recessive.
And I presume the answer isn't die.
Yeah, recessive genes. So you can have a gene that is not expressed. So the word we use for like what traits you actually show is your phenotype, like your hair color is your phenotype. So you could have an allele, a variant of a gene that's recessive, where if you have like brown and then red, the brown is dominant over red. So you could have the allele for red hair, but not have the phenotype. But if two parents have that allele, they can have a kid who has two red hair alleles and then red-haired kid. That's how that happens.
Okay, I'm just going to wrap up the questions because people are sending them in as we speak. So I'm just going to say I can't keep you forever as much as I'd like to. Yeah, exactly. So I'll just call it there. So sorry if you've got any questions. Go and subscribe to Dan's channel.
There was one more super chat though. Go with that last.
Yeah, I see it. Yeah, not a problem. So Bitter Truth for 499. Thank you so much, Bitter Truth. Gene therapies, are we making molecular forces to fight against different types of cancers and diseases?
So like there's like immunotherapies against cancers that are like miraculous. It's incredible. Like just talk about like, you know, trust in science and like results, right? Like there are types of cancer that 20 years ago would kill you that now we have incredibly effective treatments for, like miraculous. Some of these new immunotherapies, and they're very specific. It's this specific type of tumor or this specific mutation that leads to cancer. We can deal with that now that we couldn't 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. It's just amazing. And I'm just a little self-promotion here is we can't understand cancer without evolution. Something you asked way back at the beginning, Mark, right? I did a video on this over the summer. You can go check it out. It's a 3-part series, and the part on cancer is the 3rd part. It won't make sense without the other 2. So you got to watch the whole 3 parts. But like you cannot understand how cancer works and why it works the way it does without understanding the underlying evolutionary dynamics. And like it's a fascinating topic. So like, yeah, this is one of those like very practical things. Where
was that the one on virulence? Was that the virulence?
That's the first one. So the virulence is the first in the series,
gotcha.
and altruism is part 2, and then cancer is part 3. And it's you can't understand the cancer part without the other two parts. It's the math, and it's like a little bit of math, but the dynamics that govern the other two things come back and explain cancer. It's so cool. I just love how it works.
It's a really good series.
Love it.
Absolutely. And Sydney just asked, what's your view on orange, the color? Thank you, Sydney. You're killing me here. Thank you.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it. I'm so sorry. I only had about 3 questions, I swear, and everyone decided to jump in. So
no, that's fine.
Thank you so much for your questions. Well, I hope you've had a good time. This has been absolutely wonderful. I've had such a good conversation, and like I didn't even get to most of the stuff I was going to talk about. So I really
we'll talk
enjoyed
again.
It.
We'll do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd love to see your birthday's on the 9th, you said?
It's the 8th, but you know.
8th. Okay, mine's on the 13th, so we're both in the same month. Happy birthday to you too. Well, yours is in front of mine, so I should have said that first, I think. I think that's the protocol. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, if you want to, send me an invite to your birthday if you want. If not, I'll probably be in chat, depending on the time, even, you know, up to midnight, I'll be there.
Cool.
But, yeah, I'd love to come and celebrate with you. And I was going to do a birthday stream for me. So if you want to, if you like playing Gartic Phone or something, because I do enjoy Gartic Phone occasionally on celebration streams. Have you ever played that game?
No, I don't even know what that is.
It's a bit like Pictionary, but basically one person draws something and then the other person says what it is, and then the next person draws what they say, and it's like telephone. It gets so muddled.
Oh, that's pretty good.
The worse you are at drawing, the funnier it gets. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Nice. But again, Dr. Dan, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure and a really fantastic time here. I hope you've had fun.
I had a great time.
Yeah, fantastic. Oh, this is fantastic. And to everybody out there, please like, subscribe, do all the things that people say at the end of videos. Don't forget to be kind to yourself, be kind to others. Give a big shout out to Dr. Dan, give a sub to his channel, check out some videos from there because they are really good. And I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.